Orders of the day, ordre du jour.
Government orders, government bills, commons, resuming consideration of a motion respecting Senate amendments to Bill C-29, an act to provide for the establishment of a National Council for Reconciliation.
Order, order. We are in session. So I just want to ask members to please take their conversations out. Resuming debate. Reprise débat.
Resuming debate.
Government Deputy House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will be splitting my time with the member from Nepean. Before I begin, Madam Speaker, I would like to acknowledge that Canada's Parliament is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Madam Speaker, our collective journey on the path of reconciliation, healing, and understanding is not merely a path we choose to walk. It is an essential step towards a better future and an acknowledgement of past wrongs. This is about acknowledging that while we cannot change the past, we have the power and indeed the responsibility to shape a better future. That is exactly what Bill C-29, the piece of legislation we are debating today, is all about. Simply put, it would establish a National Council for Reconciliation. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was chaired by the Honourable Murray Sinclair, investigated the history and legacy of residential schools and released its final report. It came after 6 years of hearings and testimonies from more than 6,000 residential school survivors and their loved ones. The report included 94 calls to action to address the legacy of residential schools and achieve true reconciliation based on the experience and recommendations of survivors. Our government is committed to implementing each and every one of these calls to action. The legislation responds to call to actions number 53 to 56. The final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded that, quote, all levels of government must make a new commitment to reconciliation and accountability, end quote. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission further noted that Indigenous peoples and Canadians will benefit from the establishment of an oversight body to evaluate and report on progress made toward fulfilling commitments and to ensure that the necessary educational resources to advance reconciliation are available to Canadians. On this journey, it is crucial that we listen, truly listen, to the stories of those who have been affected by our history. These stories, though often fraught with pain and injustice, are vital to understanding the depth of hurt that has been caused. They remind us that behind every call to action, there are human faces and stories that deserve to be heard and acknowledged. To that end, this bill was brought forward after extensive engagement with Indigenous peoples and organizations. Our government, as well as parliamentarians on both in both chambers, have worked tirelessly to ensure that the bill before us today is at the heart of what Indigenous people have been asking for in this country. And parliamentarians have made important amendments, of which the government accepts all of them. Madam Speaker, walking the path of reconciliation requires consistent action and a desire to forge a new relationship based on mutual respect, trust, and nation-to-nation recognition to which Indigenous peoples are entitled. This work is vital, complex, and long-term. That is why it is crucial that we have systems to measure the progress we are making as a country as we work towards reconciliation, and that we hold the government accountable to its objectives. The Council would do just that. Reconciliation requires more than just words. It demands action. It challenges us to move beyond mere acknowledgement of past injustices to the implementation of concrete steps that address these wrongs. While the Leader of the Opposition offers platitudes on the necessity of reconciliation, there remains a stark contrast between his rhetoric and the actions, or lack thereof, taken by his party. Madam Speaker, that is why the National Council for Reconciliation is so important. It would be an independent, permanent body that would oversee the progress of reconciliation efforts in Canada. It aims to promote respect, dialogue, and understanding between Canadian and Indigenous peoples. The Council would provide oversight and hold the government accountable for advancing reconciliation with Indigenous communities, including monitoring and evaluating the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action. We know progress has been made, but I hope that everyone in this place would agree that there is more to do. As amended, this bill strengthens the accountability of governments to respond to Council concerns in terms of measuring progress. The establishment of such a council reflects a commitment to creating mechanisms for ongoing dialogue, respect for Indigenous rights, and concerted effort to address historical injustices and the legacy of colonialism. It signifies a step forward in the journey toward reconciliation, aiming to ensure that the actions and policies of the future are informed by a comprehensive understanding of the past and present realities faced by Indigenous peoples in Canada. I encourage my colleagues to support the bill as amended, as it represents a critical step towards bridging the gap between words and action. Miigwech, kuya namik, merci, thank you, merci.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. And you know, I think I want to thank my colleague for his comments, and I do feel that the implementation of the calls to action certainly need oversight, because the final report from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation came out in 2015, and this government has barely moved on it. I appreciated his comments, particularly about acknowledging history, particularly because we are at a time where there is a rise of residential school denialism. In fact, the Conservative leader, the member of Carleton, on the day when we were meeting with families searching the landfill, he was meeting with and doing fundraising, in fact, with a group that espouses or puts out articles regularly citing residential school denialism, particularly with the unmarked graves. I'm wondering what my colleague thinks about a need for legislation to amend, put in place legislation to deal with residential school denialism as a form of hate speech.
The honourable member for the Honourable Government Deputy House Leader.
It's certainly a tough question to answer in terms of whether or not legislation is required for that, Madam Speaker. But, you know, I would suggest that, you know, unfortunately we live in a day and age where misinformation is spread so wildly. We don't even seem to have a standard by which whom is willing to distribute that information in this day and age. I think at the heart of this is information and in making sure that Canadians know exactly what happened. We have a very difficult past to reconcile with, Madam Speaker. We have the obligation to ensure that we do everything that we possibly can. And I would even, you know, go as far to say that this is why this legislation is so important. If a council is established permanently as an act of this Parliament, it becomes much more difficult for a potential future government to dismantle it, and therefore that council will continue to exist in perpetuity to be able to monitor the progress of the calls to action.
Questions and comments? The honourable for Caribou Prince George.
Sure, quite dismayed at the comment from our NDP colleague across the way, but I'll leave that for another day. It's par for the course with this NDP team that they have. One question to our colleague across the way. Why was the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples an organization that represents 800 status and non-status off-reserve urban Indigenous peoples and the Native Women's Association of Canada not included in this program.
The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Well, you know, Madam Speaker, I don't have an answer to his specific question in terms of the particular organizations that he's referencing. What I do know is that, and as I indicated in my speech, there was an absolute ton of work done into creating this commission, into consulting with Indigenous peoples directly. I'm a partisan person, Madam Speaker. I think you would acknowledge that. When I get up in this House, I'm quite partisan. I will take the shots where I see necessary. I just really hope that on this particular issue, on an issue as important as this is something that the entire House can be supportive of. We're talking about establishing a council here with oversight. I really hope that we can put aside the partisanship of this and move forward in doing what's right, because I know at heart every member believes that.
The
Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Miville. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and good morning. Madam Speaker, C-29 corresponds to what the Bloc Québécois has been considering for a long time, a nation-to-nation relationship, and it is really part of our values, and we support this. And there was an agreement signed by by Quebec Premier, and I would like to say that in 2024, this is an act called there was an act called the Indian Act, and I think it's completely unacceptable. It's unfair and discriminatory, and I would like to hear my colleague on that.
Country Secretary.
It's certainly off topic in terms of this particular bill, but I'm happy to answer that question. I would completely agree that having an act with that name in 2024, we should be moving in the direction of replacing that and in probably updating legislation in the process.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Nepean.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak on the legislation that provides for the establishment of a National Council of Reconciliation. It would be an independent, non-political, permanent, and Indigenous-led organization whose purpose is to advance efforts for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. This Council will track our progress on implementing the calls to action, a roadmap for reconciliation. I wish to reiterate that we are committed to implementing the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, advancing reconciliation, and working in partnership with the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. We will implement all of the calls to action and advancing reconciliation in partnership with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. We recognize the crucial role played by the Senate of Canada, often referred to as the Chamber of Sober Second Thoughts. This body serves as a vital check on the legislative process, ensuring that laws enacted by the House of Commons receive thorough review and consideration. The Senate's recent amendments to a key piece of legislation exemplify its essential function. By refining terms, clarifying language, and specifying functions, the Senate has not only enhanced the clarity of the law, but also its effectiveness in serving the diverse needs of Canadians, particularly emphasizing respect and precision in matters involving Indigenous governing bodies. The amendments, such as the explicit use of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in the preamble, focus on inclusivity and acknowledgement of Canada's Indigenous peoples. They also improve governance by defining the scope and functions of the new Council and by ensuring transparency through the tabling of an annual report. These adjustments are crucial for meaningful consultation and cooperation with Indigenous communities. Let us value and respect the Senate's diligent work. Their amendments contribute significantly to making legislation more just, more precise, and better suited to serve our society's needs. The Senate's thoughtful revisions ensure that our laws reflect the voices and rights of all Canadians. Indigenous peoples in Canada, comprising First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, represent diverse and vibrant cultures with distinct traditions, languages, and histories. Today, these groups face a complex set of challenges and opportunities. Socially and economically, Indigenous people often experience high rates of poverty, lower educational attainment, health disparities, and limited access to essential services compared to non-Indigenous Canadians. These issues are rooted in historical injustice such as colonization and the residential school system. However, there is ongoing progress in addressing these challenges. Recent years have seen increased governmental and public recognition of Indigenous rights and sovereignty. Efforts towards reconciliation are evident in initiatives like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, which aim to rectify historical wrongs. Indigenous political and cultural resurgence is also notable, with Indigenous leaders playing key roles in national dialogues about environmental protection, economic development, and cultural preservation. Imagine a Canada when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action are fully realized, a nation defined by understanding, justice, and mutual respect. The impact of implementing these calls is profound, promising a future where all Canadians, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, share equally in the prosperity and the cultural richness of our country. By acknowledging and correcting the historical and systemic injustice faced by Indigenous peoples, we foster a national spirit of genuine reconciliation. This means not only recognizing past wrongs, but actively working to rectifying them. Education systems will teach the true history of Indigenous peoples, fostering understanding and respect from a young age. Health and justice systems will be reformed to eliminate systemic biases, ensuring that Indigenous communities receive equitable treatment. The economic impact will be significant as well. By supporting Indigenous businesses and integrating traditional knowledge into our economic practices, we unlock new opportunity for innovation and sustainability. Socially, as barriers are dismantled, we will see stronger, more inclusive communities across Canada, enriched by the diverse cultures and traditions of Indigenous peoples. This is not just an investment in the future of Indigenous communities, but in the future of all Canadians, creating a society that truly reflects our values of fairness and equality. These are the reasons why I stand before you to discuss the imperative of fully implementing the calls to action of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This comprehensive report is not merely a document. It is a blueprint for healing and partnership aimed at righting the historical injustices faced by Indigenous peoples in Canada. For too long, the voices of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities have been marginalized. The residential school system, a dark chapter in our national history, stripped away language, culture, and identity. The calls to action provide us a path to acknowledge these painful truths, to learn from them, and to avoid repeating mistakes of the past. Implementing these calls to action is not just a moral obligation, it is a vital step building a just society where the rights and cultures of Indigenous peoples are respected. It is about creating educational programs that reflect the true history of Canada, reforming the justice system to be equitable, and ensuring health and child welfare services meet the needs of indigenous communities. Let us embrace this opportunity to foster reconciliation, to build bridges, and to work hand in hand with indigenous communities towards a shared and equitable future. The path is laid out before us. It is time for action, commitment, and perseverance. Let us move forward, not as separate entities, but as united Canadians, honoring every chapter of our shared history. The Council, as outlined in Bill C-29, will be an independent, non-partisan body dedicated to overseeing the ongoing efforts towards reconciliation. It marks a profound shift towards ensuring that these efforts are led by those who understand them deeply, our Indigenous peoples. Notably, the Board of Directors, primarily composed of Indigenous members.
I have a point of order. The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Just a friendly reminder not to refer to Indigenous people as our Indigenous people, because we're not pets. Thanks.
I apologize, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Nepean.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the honourable member for pointing that out. I sincerely apologize. It was a mistake on my part. Notably, the Board of Directors, primarily composed of Indigenous members, will include representatives nominated by major Indigenous organizations, ensuring a broad and inclusive range of voices in guiding the Council's mission. This legislation empowers the Council to monitor and evaluate our nation's progress in addressing the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The annual report produced by the Council and the Prime Minister mandate response will ensure transparency and accountability, providing a clear measure of our progress. By incorporating the Council under the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, we are also ensuring that it has a solid structural and legal foundation to operate effectively and independently. The path to reconciliation is long and challenging, but with the establishment of the National Council for Reconciliation, we reaffirm our commitment to a just and equitable future. Let us move forward with renewed dedication and hope. In the coming years, the status of Indigenous peoples in Canada is anticipated to reflect significant advancements in reconciliation and self-determination. Building on current trends, there will likely be greater acknowledgement and implementation of Indigenous rights with increased political representation and leadership across various sectors. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Nunavut.
And I'd like to thank the member for his presentation, his intervention. I think that this bill, while it's important, is definitely not enough. And it was so unfortunate that when the Minister of Finance did her budget presentation, she didn't even mention reconciliation with Indigenous people. She didn't even mention Indigenous peoples. And I wonder if this member agrees that this Liberal government needs to really show its action and not just use symbolism when it comes to working with Indigenous peoples, when it comes to reconciliation, because when this government doesn't even increase enough what we need to do to uplift Indigenous peoples out of poverty, that he mentioned, that that marginalization didn't end when residential schools ended, that marginalization is allowed to continue because governments like this Liberal government continue to underinvest in Indigenous peoples.
The honourable member for Nepean.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I agree with the honourable member that this legislation is not just enough. This is a path towards doing what is right, what is just, and we have been doing it for the last 8.5 years. We have shown our real commitment in actually taking steps, concrete steps, implementing a lot of steps, and I agree, there's still much more work to do.
Député de Laurentides-Labelle.
Member for Laurentides-Labelle. the member for Rivière de Mille asked a question a moment ago, and he said there's not enough being done with this Indian Act. Does he agree that we need to make it a priority to show that if we truly want things to change, does my colleague agree with what his predecessor said?
The honourable member for Nepean.
Madam Speaker, I repeat that we have shown our real commitment, not just in words, but in action during the last 8.5 years. We have made it a point, and the things that we have done during the last 8.5 years, the things we are doing with this particular bill shows our real commitment in doing what is just and what is right.
The questions and comments. The honourable for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd have to disagree with, I guess my honourable colleagues bragging about everything his government did. I mean, the budget just came out, no mention of Indigenous people, and they actually put more money into auto theft than they did into the crisis of MMIWG, which sends a very clear message, as I pointed out to the minister, that Canada cares more about finding cars than it does about finding Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals. That doesn't look like reconciliation to me. I'd also like to point out that there's more kids now in care than at the height of residential schools, partly because of ongoing systemic racism, which has been reported. This government has been in power 8 years since the Truth and Reconciliation report was released in 2015. 8 years, and now they're just putting in place an oversight body after 10 years? Give me a break. I'd like to ask my honourable colleague if he's willing to be honest and admit that his government needs to do more if he's going to achieve reconciliation in this country.
The honourable member for Nepean.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have to respectfully disagree with that member. The cumulative amount that we have invested towards the Indigenous people's needs during the last 8.5 years is out there. It's public. We can see the commitment that we have shown, we have done. But I agree with that there is more needs to be done. We have been doing it and we will continue to do it.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for I have a point of order. The honourable member for Saskatoon University.
Yes, Madam Speaker. Last night I referenced 4 documents in a speech concerning wet, limp, and utterly useless paper straws. I'd like to table the 4 studies that show that it's worse for your environment, waste for your...
Honourable member, already I hear no's. There's no unanimous consent. Resuming debate. Order. Resuming debate. The honourable member Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a
Order. I want to remind the honourable member he asked his question. I gave him an answer, and I also want to remind the honourable parliamentary secretary that if he wishes to have a further conversation on this between the two, then they should step out. The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today I rise to speak to Bill C-29, an act to provide for the establishment of National Council for Reconciliation. Reconciliation. What does that word mean? In 9 years of this government, what we have seen is the word reconciliation, I believe, just become a buzzword. Reconciliation is about walking shoulder to shoulder by listening, by learning, by being open to admitting wrongs were done. C-29 is in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action 53 to 56. I'll remind this House that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was founded by our former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, our former government, Conservative government. Now, throughout these conversations, there's always finger pointing that goes on. And I would hazard that there's enough blame to go around from all sides. And Speaker, we have seen in the last 9 years through this government picking winners and losers, First Nation pitted against First Nation, First Nations pitted against non-First Nations, Métis versus Métis, Métis versus non-Métis. We have seen our Prime Minister thank Indigenous protesters who are just protesting simply the fact that the boil water advisories in their communities still are ongoing. And what did he do when they were at his fancy function? Is he thanked them for their donation. We have seen him cast away the first Indigenous female Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould, who spoke truth to power and was cast aside, Madam Speaker. We have seen this Prime Minister who has stood there with his hand on his heart and dabbing away a fake tear with a tissue, saying this is his most important relationship. And yet, as we've just heard, they just launched their 9th budget and not a mention of reconciliation for Indigenous peoples. So pardon me if we seemed a bit skeptical about what they're planning with C-29. Now, Speaker, over the time of mine being elected, whether it's my current file in mental health and suicide prevention, or previous files, transportation, or fisheries, this government likes to say that they've consulted. And is it really truly consultation or engagement, or is it simply merely checking the tick box, or a check mark in a box on a sheet saying this is what you have to say and you have to complete? True engagement means sitting at the table and fully understanding all sides. What brought us to this point? Recent years, we've heard the horrors of our residential school program, but the world is just waking up to what some of us have heard for many years. The horrors that were our residential school program, a program that was designed to drive the Indian out of the children. Thousands upon thousands of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children taken from their homes and never returned. Madam Speaker, if you've ever sat with a residential school survivor, if you ever listened to their stories, it is horrible. The start of the ground sonar search in my riding of Caribou Prince George, the ground sonar search at the former St. Joseph's Mission School, residential school in my hometown of Williams Lake. I'm on record as speaking that I grew up just down the road from this school, and yet I had no idea of the horrors that were going on at that school. These were kids that I played with, that many of them I know to this day that are my friends, indeed are my family, as my family is First Nations as well. But watching a residential school survivor come to the lands for a ceremony marking the start of the ground sonar search, and watching them shake as those memories, and become so emotional as those memories come flooding back. It's absolutely heartbreaking. You know, in 9 years of this government, they have only fully implemented 11 of the 94 calls to action, and only 8 of the 76 calls that are the federal government's responsibility. Why did it take 4 years for the Liberals to implement this after the Prime Minister made the announcement about it in 2018? Why are they still not bringing in or listening to all of the Indigenous groups that want to be part of this? The Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, an organization that represents over 800 status and non-status off-reserve urban Indigenous peoples, and the Native Women's Association of Canada, an organization that represents women and children on and off reserve. At the committee, our Conservative team, Bloc and NDP, passed the motion to include these 2 national organizations at Council. However, when the rubber hit the road, when it really came time to make sure that they were part of it, our NDP colleagues sided with our Liberal friends, their Liberal friends, and voted to exclude the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, effectively silencing the voices of 800,000 off-reserve Indigenous peoples. Why? Reconciliation is about inclusion. Reconciliation is about recognizing economic prosperity, allowing our Indigenous peoples to recognize, or allowing Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities to recognizing full potential. This is unbelievable that we're still debating this bill. The fact that this bill is still here, the fact that we're still in the process of debating it after having numerous amendments, speeches, just speaks to the government's failure to meaningfully consult and advance this issue. Now they're going to stand up and say that I guarantee you we're going to hear it at one point that it's been blocked, there's been lots of dilatory motions from this side. They have the majority, Madam Speaker. If they want to push something through with their NDP colleagues, they can push it through. Now, our Conservative colleagues worked diligently at the committee to improve the bill. Isn't that the message we always say? Just let it pass. Let's get it to committee, and we'll make it better there. But again, what we've heard that they blocked and they left out those 2 important groups. We talk about consultation. Does it really truly represent the work that they've done, or the consultation that's done? Does it truly represent all the Indigenous people, or does it just simply reflect the views and those that are friends of this Liberal government? We know recently that there are about 113 Indigenous groups in Ontario that are taking this government to court over boil water advisories. This government talks a good game, Madam Speaker, but the truth is in their actions. As important as this bill is, it also highlights the failure of a Liberal government to listen to Canadians and to listen meaningful and to consult with Indigenous peoples. This is, of course, not the first time we've spoken about the Liberals' inability to consult and listen. They always seem to just go down the path and tick the boxes of the groups that are in agreement with them, and they use that as their record of consultation, yet they have left a whole section, a whole community of Indigenous peoples out in this when it pertains to C-29. You know, here's a concern that we have is that time and again we see these bills that come forth and it's not perfect. And then the consequences are faced afterwards. Now, you'll hear comments from the other side that say, well, we should never let perfection get in the way of getting something done. You know, I've talked about winners and losers with this government. I want to talk about my friend Chief Willie Sellers in Williams Lake. Here's a chief of his community that, in all sense of the word, is leading by example. Isn't waiting for the government to provide handouts, has done everything to lead his nation and his community to economic prosperity. Alice Ross, a provincial MLA in British Columbia, walks the walk. I remember sitting in a meeting or a presentation with him about 10 years ago, and he said this: we don't need all these fancy words. We don't need to listen to an unelected group, the United Nations, the calls to action. He says, what we need is government to get out of the way, to allow us to chart our own path forward. You know, is this council going to be yet just another arm of the minister of the day? These are questions that we have. Will this government even listen to the National Council? They've spent the last 9 years of over-promising and under-delivering on Indigenous issues. How many communities still have the boil water advisories? It's unbelievable to this day. I remember one of the first speeches that we did in this House, one of the first emergency debates that we had was the suicide epidemic on Attawapiskat First Nation. Speaker. And it was heartbreaking for me to hear the stories that we were hearing. Sadly, have things gotten better for Indigenous peoples in the last 9 years under this government? When in 2015 the Prime Minister stood and promised that this was his most important relationship. It is complex. I will give them that. But if it truly was his most important relationship, when they just announced so much spending in a budget that we now spend more money servicing our debt than we do on health care, and the books were open, the safe was open, they were throwing money at everything, yet not a mention of Indigenous peoples or reconciliation. It's frustrating. And what will be measured with this council? What gets measured gets done. So Conservatives will be supporting this bill because we believe in the premise that we have to have everyone around the table. that true reconciliation begins with understanding, begins with, as I said earlier on, listening. Open heart, open ears, open eyes. My concern with this government is that this is just yet another, as I said earlier on, just to placate those. There's no real meaning or value behind doing this. It's frustrating that we're here. I've already mentioned this once earlier on in my speech. It's frustrating that we're debating this today when this could have been done previously. 9 years, as I get heckled from the other side. 9 years they've had to get this done. And now, in the 11th hour of the last few shreds of power that they have, they put this forward. It's taken forever for them to do this. Madam Speaker, with that being said, as I mentioned, we will be supporting this bill. We hope that we can see some amendments being done that we put forth. We hope that all Indigenous peoples are included at the table. The Congress, the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, as well as the Native Women's Association of Canada, are two organizations that we feel should be included in this and should have a say, at least one director around the table. And with that, Madam Speaker, I thank you for this time. I thank you for the colleagues for listening, and I'll take the questions. Thanks.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre. I know she's waiting for her lights. Wrong lights. Oh, there we go.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. And I have to say, I appreciate the empathy from, my honourable colleague. But, the Conservatives have quite a history. If we want to talk about their history with reconciliation, I'll start with former Prime Minister Harper, who said that MMIWG wasn't on his radar. Tanya Capo, who's an Indigenous lawyer, said in a span of a week, the Conservative government confirmed their feelings of indifference, disregard, and utter lack of respect for Indigenous people. Fast forward to today with their current leader, the member from Carleton, the current leader of the Conservative Party, who actively fraternizes with residential school denialists. In fact, article titled Polyev delivers speech to a group criticized for residential school denialism, to which the former national chief of the AFN said, I condemn any association with denialist views and the deep hurt they cause to our survivors and their families, Archibald said in a media statement. He himself has had to apologize in the past for minimizing and denying the impacts of residential school, to which he had to apologize when he was a minister. Do you want to talk about 9 years? I want to talk about before the last 9 years. I'm not saying this government is doing a good job, but it's pretty rich for the Conservatives to sit there when their leader actively fraternizes with residential school denialists and talk about how they care about Indigenous people. I'd like my honourable colleague, if he will acknowledge the level of denialism that his party participates in.
Yeah. I do want to remind members, I'm hearing these side conversations about, the opportunity that the speaker gives to members, and I just want to indicate to those individuals, I look at the room to see how many people are getting up for questions and comments, and I base the decision as to how much time to allow on that. And so I just want to remind members that I am paying time, and I will actively indicate when it's time to end the question and when it's time to answer the question. The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yeah, it's disappointing, Madam Speaker, to hear the comments from our colleague across down the way, Madam Speaker. It's interesting. I always say that those in glass houses should not throw rocks, Madam Speaker, and I would say this is that it was our former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, that started the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I can say this, that I've never seen a Prime Minister be more indignant. On one hand, stand here before cameras, whenever the cameras were on, say that this is his most important relationship, and then absolutely turn away and shun our first Indigenous female Attorney General, a person who is a dear and close friend of mine. I've seen over the last 9 years the damage that this Prime Minister has done within Indigenous communities, pitting Indigenous community against Indigenous community, pitting Indigenous community against non-Indigenous community. I've seen this Prime Minister smirk and smile when hearing the plights of those in our gala or in our House talking about their communities and the Indigenous peoples within their communities and that they are a part of. I'll remind my colleague that this is a government that's in power. This is a government that made a tremendous amount of promises in 9 years previously, over the last 9 years, and that have failed at every step. This is a Prime Minister that thanked Indigenous protesters simply protesting the fact that they do not have boiled water in their communities, or potable water in their communities. You have to boil.
I gave the honourable member the same amount of time as I gave the question, and we need to have other questions. I see other people have decided to stand and rise. The honourable questions and comments. The honourable minister.
Madam Speaker, and I was listening to the member's speech with interest, and I would first of all say that it's encouraging to hear that the Conservatives are considering supporting this legislation, given that they did not support the passage of the UN Declaration Act. So having heard that from this member and other members in the Conservative Party, would the member commit to allowing this bill to carry on the voices today so that we don't have to wait another week to vote on it?
Member for Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My honourable colleague knows full well that that is a discussion at House leadership and not one that I can speak to. Madam Speaker, it's disappointing that this is a minister of the Crown and a minister of this file, and that it has taken them 4 years to get to this point, Madam Speaker, and one that I have a great deal of respect for in terms of the work that we did with respect to 988 and mental health of Canadians, but one that she has stumbled into this file and has stumbled along the way, likely because of the leadership or lack thereof of our Prime Minister.
The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his empathetic speech. We see that he cares deeply about Indigenous peoples and that he cares deeply about reconciliation. I'm glad that he'll be voting in favor of C-29. Now, although the Conservatives are not in power, they're in opposition, they could still do some things to promote reconciliation. For example, not long ago, we saw the Conservative leader participate in a major celebration of John A. Macdonald, the man who hung Louis Riel and set up residential schools and caused famine among First Nations. Does my colleague really think that this kind of celebration is appropriate in a reconciliation context?
Madam Speaker, it's interesting we get these questions from the bloc and from others talking about the past and when we're looking forward to the future. Madam Speaker, we're here today to talk about a bill, C-29, which we all agree is important and needed. Madam Speaker, and unfortunately, we have parties that just want to continue point fingers, doing everything, taking a very nonpartisan piece of legislation and turning it into a partisan hit job.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Haliburton-Kawartha Lakes Brock.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I really do appreciate the words from my colleague from northern British Columbia. I know he represents a number of First Nations and Métis in his riding and does a fantastic job bringing their voices here to Ottawa, and you saw that reflected in his speech. I think my question to him revolves around this piece of legislation, specifically the fact that the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, despite representing a large number of Indigenous people living off reserve, when you're talking about those living off the First Nations, they represent status, non-status, Métis, and yet they are left off the founding table that then dictates the path going forward. And that is something I think we advocated strongly for in committee, and unfortunately the government didn't listen, so I'd like to get his comments on that. Thank you, Speaker.
Honourable member for Cariboo Prince George.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is disappointing. We know that there is a very large community of Indigenous youth, status and non-status youth living off reserve and within urban centres and families that live off reserve. Our family is one of them, and yet this government has chosen to leave the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, an organization that represents over 800,000 status and non-status Indigenous peoples, as well as the Native Women's Association of Canada, an organization that represents women and children on and off reserve. But it is, Madam Speaker, it is par for the course. We see this time and time again with this government that they chose to pick winners and losers, and they've done the same with C-29. It's disappointing.
Statements by members, déclaration de député. The honourable member for Mississauga Lakeshore.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to recognize the 50th anniversary of the Carnation Revolution, also referred to as Freedom Day in Portugal. At the crack of dawn on April 25, 1974, songs of liberty played over radio. It marked the start of what became known as the Bloodless Revolution. As the army stood guard at the capital, children began placing carnations in the barrels of soldiers' rifles. That love and compassion tugged at the hearts of citizens and generals alike. By day's end, the people peacefully triumphed over a fascist regime, ending 40 years of totalitarian rule. Portugal and its diaspora around the world gathered to celebrate 25 de Abril, based on values of liberty, equality, and the rule of law. It is also a reminder for all of us that democracy and freedom must prevail. To my fellow Portuguese across Canada, feliz dia de liberdade.
The member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. After 9 Liberal Pinocchio budgets and 9 straight deficits where every Liberal projection has been wrong, this NDP Liberal government is still not worth the cost. After 9 years, we have a new Liberal double-double. NDP Liberals have doubled the cost of government, doubled Canada's debt, doubled the taxes Canadians pay, doubled the interest on Canada's debt, and doubled the cost of rent and mortgages. Our government services twice as good, as our health care twice as good, as defence and national security twice as good. The answer, of course, is all or worse. Liberals have added more debt to Canada than all other governments combined in our history, and now Canadians pay $44 billion in interest on the Canadian credit card. And the Liberal budget plan will drive this number to $60 billion in 5 years. Today, that's more money than we spend on health care. After 9 years, the Prime Minister is not worth the cost. But there's good news. Common sense Conservatives will replace Liberal hurt with Conservative hope. We will axe the tax, build the home.
Honourable member for Oakville North, Burlington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Organ donation saves lives. One organ donor can save up to 8 lives. However, less than 25% of people living in Canada are registered donors, even though 90% of Canadians say they support organ donation. In Ontario, 1,400 people on average are waiting for a life-saving organ, with thousands more needing transformative tissue donation. And sadly, every 3 days, someone will die waiting. Thanks to a private member's bill put forward by my colleague from Calgary Confederation, becoming an organ donor in Canada is easier than ever. Ontario residents like me are able to tick a box on our tax return indicating whether or not we'd like to become an organ and tissue donor. 2.5 million Canadians in Ontario and Nunavut since 2022 have indicated their intention. I encourage all provinces and territories to sign up for this life-saving initiative. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Madam Speaker, more than 165,000 new cases of traumatic brain injury occur annually in Canada. In fact, this current number is likely underestimated because of underreporting of cases stemming from concussions, intimate partner violence, combat injuries, and survival of toxic substance poisoning. Beyond the significant physical damage that people experience from traumatic brain injury, we know there is a link between brain injury and further challenges with mental health, substance misuse, homelessness, and incarceration. It is necessary to support education and prevention measures and interventions. My honourable colleague for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford has brought forward Bill C-277 to establish a national strategy on Brain Injuries Act. The legislation is driven by the support of so many living with brain injuries and organizations like the Nanaimo Brain Injury Society, who provide tremendous support and advocacy. I urge all honourable members to add their support to the voices calling for a national strategy on brain injuries. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member Sudbury.
What do metallurgical mushrooms, decomposition, and capturing wind energy on cars have in common? Well, Madam Speaker, those are just some of Sudbury's Science Fair projects heading to the National Science Fair competition. 63 students participated in this year's annual Sudbury Regional Science Fair. 7 students from Llewellyn Park Secondary School in my riding of Sudbury will be heading to Ottawa for the Canada-wide Science Fair to showcase their projects. For over 55 years, Sudbury students in grades 7 to 12 have been showcasing science experiments, studies, and innovative endeavors that have taken weeks and sometimes even months of efforts to pull together. Madam Speaker, I want to congratulate all participants of the 2024 Sudbury Regional Science Fair. I also want to extend a big congratulations to this year's winners: Benjamin Kawa, Felix Nog, Eden Abels, Jack O'Connell, Violent Simon, Camille Landry, and Xavier Smart. Wishing all of you the best of luck at the national competition. Go Team Llewellyn.
The honourable member for Saskatoon University.
Madam Speaker, the science is in. What's terrible for your pocketbook, for your health, and the economy? Paper straws, and they suck. And yet this radical Liberal government wants to force everyone to use them. After 9 long years of this Liberal government, they and the paper straws are not worth the cost. Everything is getting more expensive, while the Liberals focus on banning things that science shows that are better for the environment, better for you, and better for the economy. Canada should be a superpower in plastics recycling, and we will be, just not under this current Prime Minister. Limp, wet, and utterly useless. Paper straws and Liberal governments are not worth the cost.
That's right. Good job. The honourable member for Nepean.
Madam Speaker, the Nepean Nighthawks Field Hockey Club is dedicated to fostering a love for field hockey among youth. Field hockey in Ottawa stretches back to the 1950s. A recent explosion of participation in Ottawa region began in 2007. Interestingly, unlike globally, 70% of Ottawa members are female. Nepean Nighthawks' vision includes fostering sport participation for life. Their goals include reaching out to underserved communities in Ottawa and build a world-class field hockey complex to serve the local field hockey community. This club is particularly noted for its inclusive Stick Together program, which emphasizes teamwork, sportsmanship, and the development of field hockey skills for all ages and skill levels. The Nighthawks are committed to reconciliation and actively promote the participation of Indigenous youth. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Scarborough North.
Madam Speaker, April is Oral Health Month in Canada, an opportunity to highlight good oral health as an essential component of overall health. In Scarborough North, the Filipino-Canadian Dental Hygienists Society has offered no-cost dental hygiene services to residents in need. Most recently, they partnered with the Filipino Centre Toronto and the Chinese Cultural Centre of Greater Toronto to provide drop-in checkups and cleanings. When I visited their mobile dental clinic last Sunday, I was met by bright smiles, and I thanked the volunteer dentists and dental hygienists for their tireless efforts. This month, the Canadian Dental Association reminds everyone to brush twice a day, floss daily, check for signs of gum disease, and visit their dentist regularly. Now, with the new Canadian Dental Care Plan, up to 9 million people without coverage will soon have access to the dental care they need. Merci.
The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
It's an honor to rise today and recognize the work of my friend Barb Ward Burkett, who's the Executive Director of the Prince George Native Friendship Centre. Also recognizing an incredible program that started in my riding at Caribou Prince George. What started as a small grassroots movement, a movement to end violence against women and children, has grown into an international inspiration supported by millions. Spurred on by the incredible loss and sorrow of families of over 20 women and girls who disappeared or have been murdered on the infamous Highway 16, Highway of Tears, Raven Lacerte and her father Paul have taken one single moose hide and turned it into an international movement. A movement that has spurred thousands of conversations, workshops, marches, and meetings. Today I'm extremely proud to honor Barb and the Moose Hide campaign for their boundless efforts to end violence against Indigenous women and girls. On April 30th, Barb will be represented the 5 millionth Moose Hide pin in recognition of her tireless work. Thank you, Barb, and to the Moose Hide campaign.
The honourable member for Mississauga, Erin Mills.
Madam Speaker, as this week has been National Volunteer Week, I'd like to take a moment today to speak about the importance of volunteer work. Each year, the Canada Revenue Agency congratulates and thanks volunteers from across the country, particularly because thousands of them actively help support free tax clinics under the Community Volunteer Income Tax Program. Last year, these free tax clinics made it possible for almost 650,000 Canadians with a modest income to file their taxes and receive more than $1.75 billion in benefits, credits, and refunds. More than 3,400 community organizations composed of more than 14,700 volunteers contributed to achieving these results. I encourage all members to take a moment to thank all of these phenomenal volunteers and this program. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Thornhill.
Yud Aleph Nisan is approaching, marking 122 years since the Lubavitcher Rebbe's light began to illuminate the world. The spiritual giant of the Jewish people, the Rebbe's teaching transcends borders and touches all of humanity. He was one of the most prolific thinkers in the recent history of Judaism, whose deep interpretation of Torah and Talmud and Halakha and Kabbalah and philosophy and Hasidus guides Jews and non-Jews everywhere. In his teachings and his letters, every verse in the story eternal to Torah is as relevant today as when it was given at Sinai, and we find the answers to our most profound questions. Those teachings, with the help daily of Rabbi Kaplan of Thornhill, inspire me throughout my private and public life. In the face of darkness, and there is a lot of darkness, we should remember the Rebbe's wisdom and his love for every Jew and every person. And on this day, we are reminded to strengthen his call to bring light into the world, to participate, to share, to invest in education, and to deepen the moral foundations through clarity and the existence of Jews everywhere.
Nice. The honourable member for Edmonton Manning.
Madam Speaker, after 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, Canadians are struggling to make ends meet. The Liberal April Fool's joke was a 23% carbon tax increase. April Fool's jokes are supposed to last one day, but this one continues fueling high inflation. In Ottawa, the Prime Minister's policies made the price of gas at the pumps jump by 20 cents, nearly 20 cents a litre, reaching their highest level since 2022. Still, the Liberals pretend their tax and spend policies are helping Canadians. When will this government start helping start helping people instead of hurting them? When will they do the right thing and pass Bill C-234 to axe the tax on farmers and food? One thing we know for sure, as prices on everything continues to go up, driven by costly carbon tax, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Vimy. Thank you, Madam Speaker. My address to this House today is a solemn declaration of our duty to remember one of the darkest chapters in modern history, the systematic destruction of a people by the Ottoman Empire during the Armenian Genocide. Let us take this moment to honor the memory of the 1.5 million innocent lives lost or destroyed just over a century ago. Let us remember that this happened to people who had been living in Anatolia for 1,500 years.
Just a few months ago, after 2 millennia of existence, the Armenian enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan basically ceased to exist. With Turkish military support and Russia's inaction as peacekeepers, Azerbaijan's military offensive ended with the region's 100,000 Armenians fleeing as refugees to Armenia. Let us recognize the pain and suffering endured of the Armenian people and commit to never forget the Armenian genocide.
The Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Today I recognize the accomplishments of esteemed historian and Black Canadian heritage expert Elise Harding Davis. Throughout her career, Elise elevated positive Black history in Canada, earning many accolades, including the Order of Ontario designation, being named a 100 Accomplished Black Canadian Woman, receiving the Ontario Black Historical Society's Daniel Hill Award, the Ontario Museum Association's Award of Excellence, and the Queen Elizabeth Diamond and Jubilee medals, the Ontario Historical Society's Connaught Shane Award as well. Over 60 years, Elise has highlighted how African Canadians were essential to Canada's development and was the first Black female curator at the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. Elise comes from a family of strong character. Her late sister, Shelley Harding Smith, was Canada's first Black female master electrician and activist who was a friend and a mentor to me personally. Their great-grandfather was a slave, and both Elise and Shelley progressed in a challenging world where they let nothing stand in their way. August 1st this year will mark the 90th anniversary of Emancipation Day, marking the day Canada's Slavery Abolition Act came into effect. Canada still needs to apologize for the enslavement of Black Canadians. An official apology would mean a lifetime of work recognized. Elise exemplifies the true meaning of preserving Black history in Canada. Her legacy will no doubt inspire future generations. Thank you.
L'honorable député de Laurentides-Labelle.
The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. Next Monday is Earth Day, the planet's leading environmental event. This day seeks to cultivate our awareness of environmental and climate issues. Let's recall a few facts. July 2023 was the hottest month in human history, and last month was the 10th consecutive month to break a heat record. Right here in Quebec and in the rest of Canada, unprecedented wildfires ravaged our forests and made the air in our cities the most polluted in the world last summer. We're in a climate emergency, and Canada's slowness to wean itself off oil is a millstone around our neck. So anyone who calls himself an environmentalist should support Quebec independence. With our clean energy, we would finally have the latitude to become an example to follow, maybe even inspire our neighbor, Canada. As a woman concerned about climate security and as a sovereigntist, I'm convinced that Quebec being a country would be good for everyone.
Madam
Speaker, Canadians, especially in British Columbia and the North Okanagan Shuswap, are seeing that after 9 years, this Prime Minister and his NDP Liberal government are simply not worth the cost. Their April 1st 23% carbon tax increase has seen gas prices push past $1.75 per litre in the interior and over the $2 mark in other parts of BC. The carbon tax only adds to the cost for farmers who have no choice but to pay if they're to produce food for Canadian families. One chicken farmer in the Shuswap paid over $100,000 last year alone just for his carbon tax bill. Because of this NDP Liberal government, that carbon tax bill will increase another 23% this year, making it even more difficult for Canadian families to afford food. Will the Prime Minister take the step to axe the tax on farmers and food and by immediately passing Bill C-234 in its original form, or will he continue to prove that he and his NDP partners are simply not worth the cost?
The honourable member for Toronto Danforth.
Today I rise to commemorate the 50th anniversary of a significant moment in Canadian queer women's history, the Brunswick Four. In 1974, Adrian, Pat, Sue, and Lamar were arrested for refusing to leave the Brunswick House, a popular Toronto bar, after they had taken the stage to sing the song "I Enjoy Being a Dyke" during an amateur performance night. They returned as an act of defiance, but were met with violence at the hands of police, and they were charged. Dubbed the Brunswick Four, a legal defense fund was set up in their name, and at trial, all charges were dismissed except for one for disturbing the peace. Long subjected to police harassment, the Brunswick Four became a symbol of resistance for the gay and lesbian community. Their determination to combat systemic prejudice serves as an inspiration, especially in the fight for 2S LGBTQIA+ community. Thank you.
Oral questions, questions orales. The honourable member for Thornhill.
Another day and more evidence of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister that is just not worth the cost. Former bank governor and proud Liberal David Dodge says the new federal budget certainly is not helpful to dealing with the inflationary fire, making it harder for Canadians' families to afford anything. Young people saddled with this Prime Minister's addiction to spending. The call is coming from inside of the Liberal House. Will the Prime Minister listen to experts, to business leader, to his own party, and millions of Canadians struggling to get by and just stop the spending?
Stop it.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
The lowest debt and deficit in the G7, Madam Speaker, a AAA credit rating, and a budget that presents a message of fairness for this country, fairness for current and future generations, a vision that they would cut. They already, before even reading the budget, said that they would not support it. That is a budget that supports childcare, that supports pharmacare, and understanding that Canadians have to have dental care in this country. Canadians who can't otherwise afford it will have the support of this government. And that more homes be built, Madam Speaker. That is vital in this country, and they're standing against every single one of those.
Good answer. Member for Thornhill.
Madam Speaker, the problem is that nobody believes them anymore, and this budget is the opposite of fairness. It is unfair to saddle our kids with billions of dollars of debt that they'll be paying for years. It is unfair to force the inflationary spending onto grocery bills of every single family. It is unfair to keep interest rates high while millions struggle to pay their mortgages. The number of Canadians who can't afford to pay their bills has more than doubled over the last month. So will the Liberals finally fix the budget so Canadians can keep their homes, put gas in their cars, and put food on their table?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition and the Conservative Party seem to be good at posing for photo ops and pretending to care about people in food bank lineups, while our government has introduced the most comprehensive package of competition reforms in Canadian history to increase competition and bring down grocery prices. But how cruel and heartless do you have to be as a party to vote against feeding kids in school?
Right. Shame.
And that party over there has voted once already against the National School Food Program, and we've introduced it in Budget 2024, and we're going to see them vote.
Member for Thornhill.
Mirror, mirror on the wall. That's all I hear from that member. The Speaker, Madam Speaker, the spending spree just isn't limited to the costly government photo ops that he's talking about. He's been here for 9 years. The Liberal insiders and elites are the ones getting in on the action too. We learned this week that the RCMP raided the home of a guy who grifted $20 million of taxpayers for the Arrive scam app. The Prime Minister failed to get the money back. This House ordered it. So will someone over there tell their boss to get the cash back?
That's right.
The Honourable Minister.
Madam Speaker, as I said yesterday in the House, our government takes the use of taxpayers' money extremely seriously. We welcome investigations. Madam Speaker, that are taking place, including the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, that, as is well known, publicly raided a residence earlier this week. Madam Speaker, we've said anybody who abused taxpayers' money will face the consequences, and of course we will seek to recuperate all money that has been misallocated. That's right.
The Honourable Member for Beauce. Madam Speaker, after 9 years of this Prime Minister who's not worth the cost, Our farmers are crying out in large numbers this morning in Beauce to express their anger at a government that's completely out of touch with reality. Our farmers are being asked to fill our pantries while the Bloc Liberal Coalition is blocking passage of Bill C-234, which would remove the carbon tax on propane and natural gas used to heat buildings and dry grain in order to lower food prices. Will the Prime Minister and the Bloc use common sense and say yes to this request from Canadian farmers? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. I find it strange that a member for Quebec would ask this question about C-234 because it won't apply to Quebec. But last week, they had an opportunity to prioritize this bill. But what did they do? They switched it with a different bill. So they have to walk the talk, Madam Speaker. He should convince his colleagues to move forward on C-234. The honourable member for Beauce. Thank you, Madam Speaker. This answer just proves how out of touch this government is. I invite the government and the Bloc to go to Beauce today and tell farmers that the carbon tax doesn't apply in Quebec. I've got room in my car after question period. No farmers, no food, Madam Speaker. Something the Bloc Liberal Coalition just doesn't get. The Bloc wants to radically increase the carbon tax again, proving once again that a vote for the Bloc will cost you dearly. When will the government finally pass Bill C-234 in its original form, Madam Speaker? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Madam Speaker, I don't know why it's a member for Quebec who's asking this question, because the bill will have no impact on Quebec. I would understand if it was coming from a member from Ontario. This member needs to convince his colleagues to move forward with C-234. It's their bill. They have that opportunity. They had the opportunity, but 2 or 3 times they've swapped it out for something else. That's not our fault. That's their fault. The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. Madam Speaker, yesterday my colleague for Drummond read the Minister page 83 of the 2024 budget, which reads, expanding access to halal mortgages. The Minister replied, no, we want to limit it. We just want to explore it, look at it, see if there's anything we can do. And besides, it's private. It's not a government program. In short, a great amount of unease. If they don't know where they're going with their halal mortgages, if it's not up to the government, if they want to frame it rather than expand it, what's it doing in the budget? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, and merci beaucoup pour la question.
Thanks very much for the question.
Not mean exclusion, and that's why we really need to make sure that we are protecting Canadians with products that already exist within our financial institutions, within private companies. And that's why the government is now announcing to consult with financial service providers and diverse communities to understand how federal policies can protect Canadians from abuses. And I hope that all parties across the aisles can get on board with this to make sure that Canadians in this financial times and these economic times are protected.
The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. Madam Speaker, we may have a partial answer. Over the past few months, the media have been reporting dissatisfaction among members of the Muslim community with certain positions taken by the Liberal government. According to Radio-Canada, a Muslim group even threatened to cut off the Liberal Party's funding of $680,000. That would mean they're leaving the Liberals for the NDP and the Conservatives. The Liberal solution, as always, is to pander. Are halal mortgages in the budget an olive branch extended to a fringe of the Muslim community? The Honourable Minister. Madam Speaker, I think the Bloc is going off the rails a little bit. They don't know where they're heading with this. They don't want to vote in favour of the budget. Even though there's good things in it for Quebec, there's a whole bunch of things that are important to Quebecers. So they don't want to talk about those things because they know it's good for Quebecers, but it's not good for the Bloc.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Pay your bills or buy your groceries. That's the dilemma for too many Canadians. Big oil and gas are doing just fine by gouging Canadians at the pumps and making record profits. Why? Because this government lets them. Liberals caved to lobbyists and stepped back instead of making big oil pay what they owe. And don't expect better from Conservatives because they're focused on taking Canadians' dental care and free medication. Why is this government letting ultra-rich CEOs rip off Canadians?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
By eliminating inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, Madam Speaker, by eliminating or introducing rather a tax on share buybacks. There's other examples I could give, but this government has presented a vision that says to the corporate sector and the oil and gas sector that they have responsibilities from a tax perspective. And what do we see? Revenue generated that goes towards funding vital programs in this country that ensure a fairness vision. That vision translates to child care, pharmacare, a national child school food program, among other things, Madam Speaker.
Good job. Honourable Member for Hamilton Centre.
These Liberals are so out of touch, Madam Speaker, and just as New Democrats have delivered social programs to help Canadians, the Conservatives are already campaigning to cut dental care and pharmacare, and it is absolutely shameful. People are drowning in debt just to keep up, while corporations are swimming in record profits. Liberals and Conservatives don't have the courage to challenge the status quo because it benefits them and their insider crony friends. Madam Speaker, New Democrats want to tackle corporate greed. Why won't this Liberal government?
I want to remind the Honourable Member South for St. Margaret's South Shore. He has a habit of heckling and raising his voice where it is not supposed to. I would ask him to please refrain to do so. The Honourable Member, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, it's very interesting. I've heard that member now for a number of years talk about, yes, the issues that he's also raised, but a vision on the environment, which I'm wondering where exactly the NDP is on these days. Carbon pricing is vital to this country's future. It really reflects an approach of responsibility from an environment policy perspective that I thought they stood for, but they're wavering, they're flip-flopping, and I sympathize, as others do, with the NDP. It's a very difficult time. They have tough decisions to make, but I hope that they end up on the right side of history with this issue, Madam Speaker. I really do.
Honourable Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes Brock.
Speaker, gas prices are the highest they've been in years. In my Ontario community, prices are as high as $1.80 a litre. Sadly, the Prime Minister gave no relief to Canadians and increased the carbon tax by 23%. Worse, when the carbon tax quadruples, it will add 61 cents to the price of a litre of gas. It's clear the Prime Minister is not worth the cost, as Canadians work twice as hard to take in half as much. When will the Prime Minister axe the tax so Canadians can afford to get to work, get groceries, take their kids to practice?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, what's baffling listening to the members from the side opposite is that they're not listening to economists from across this country. Last week it was about 200 economists. Now it's over 300. It's about 350 economists have written to us an open letter saying specifically that most families receive more in rebates than they pay in carbon pricing. In other words, the policy is designed to ensure it does not raise the cost of living for most Canadians. And they say climate change, on the other hand, poses a real threat to Canadians' economic well-being. I'm going to listen to the economists.
A member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes Brock.
Well, Speaker, the economists and the experts I listen to are the people in my riding paying $1.80 a litre for gasoline now. The Prime Minister could reduce the price of a litre of gas by 20 cents right now by axing the carbon tax. Speaker, the Liberals have out-of-control spending and Canadians are broke. Rent, mortgages are doubling. Inflation through the roof. We spend more money to service the debt than we do transfers to the provinces on health care. Canadians are tapped out, Speaker. They're seeing no relief from this government. So when will the Prime Minister do the right thing? Call a carbon tax election.
Honorable Secrétaire parlementaire du ministre de l'Énergie et des Ressources naturelles.
Speaker, let's listen to another expert. The former Conservative Prime Minister of UK, Boris Johnson, came to Canada to teach the Conservative Party a lesson about the dangers of climate change denial nonsense. He said voters continue to care deeply about the environment. They want solutions that are going to be cost-effective. Madam Speaker, we agree, and both the PBO and over 350 economists agree that the carbon pricing and the rebates will help 8 out of 10 Canadians better off. The Conservatives' only plan, Madam Speaker, is to let the planet burn. Their chief insult...
Order. When the honourable member asks a question, he should listen to the answer and he shouldn't be heckling. And some of his colleagues were heckling as well. So I would just ask members to please tone down and listen to the questions and the answers that are being posed. The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Well, Madam Speaker, after 9 years, Canada's emissions are rising and the Liberal carbon tax is making life unaffordable. On April the 1st, the NDP Liberals increased the carbon tax, and across the country today, Canadians are paying way more at the pumps. Many Canadians who have been struggling to pay their bills throughout the cold and dark winter, who might have been planning a summer road trip, might not be able to afford it now. Why are the NDP Liberals giving Canadians a cruel summer instead of axing the tax?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I think it's important that we be clear. Under the previous Conservative government, emissions were on the way up with no plan to bring them down. Right. We are on track to meet our 2026 targets. We are on track to meet the Paris targets. We are taking the action needed to reduce emissions. But more than that, if we're going to talk about affordability, let's talk about an economist from Calgary who said carbon pricing is definitely not to blame for affordability challenges. Again, I'm going to listen to the economists.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
I choose to listen to the people in my riding who are paying 20 cents more a litre because of the NDP Liberal carbon tax. An inconvenient truth for the Liberals is that the only time that emissions went down in Canada was under Prime Minister Stephen Harper's government. In fact, if they want to listen to someone, they should listen to a fellow Liberal, the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, who after losing a by-election said the carbon tax is wrong. Tens of millions of Canadians agree. These are the people we listen to. Why don't these NDP Liberals?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, if she's concerned, if the member opposite is concerned about the price of gas in Alberta, may want to speak to the Premier, who on April 1st increased the Alberta gas tax. And by the way, that's not connected to a rebate. Our federal carbon price backstop pays more to 8 out of 10 Canadians than they actually pay in carbon pricing. But the Premier's gas tax, that was just an add-on.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Madam Speaker, 40% debt to GDP, the metric the Finance Minister used just last year as her anchor that she's now cut loose. $40 billion more in debt last year, $40 billion more debt projected this fiscal year, $40 billion debt projected the following fiscal year. I sense a pattern. After 9 years of this Liberal NDP government, Canadians are being asked to hold the line at 40-something, but there's no real plan for that. Will the Prime Minister tell Canadians under 40 how much of their future he's blown?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
The member opposite is a graduate of the Ivy School of Business in my riding, Madam Speaker. He knows economics, so he knows, of course, that Canada has the lowest debt-to-GDP ratio in the G7, and that debt-to-GDP ratio is set to continue to come down. But what he's really saying by raising these issues is that they don't stand in favor of a vision of fairness for this country, one of child care, farmer care, dental care, and building more homes. The National School Food Program that my colleague mentioned before is also vital to that vision. They stand against all of it.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre, and I want to ask members not to be heckling.
Madam Speaker, it appears that member didn't get the memo, but what's causing inflation in Canada is actually deficits, and the Bank of Canada governor said so. The interest cost to service Canada's growing debt has risen to over $54 billion, doubling in the last few years. It's now more than what we spend on health care. This is a cascade of debt obligations, and there is no plan to reverse it. This NDP Liberal government is not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister advise why he continues a fiscal course that will saddle young Canadians with sky-high debt for years?
Here. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Now I really have to question the member's understanding of economics, Madam Speaker. I thought he knew, but I wonder now. Inflation is a global phenomenon, and in Canada, in fact, it's declining. What I would say is back to that member, What is he going to do when it comes to voting on the budget? Is he going to stand and declare an intention to support childcare in this country, to make sure that we have a vision of fairness so that kids can go to school with their bellies full, so we can have dental care in this country, pharmacare, all these things? He's against it.
The honourable member for Joliette. Madam Speaker, in their budgets, the Liberals like to illustrate their measures with concrete examples of fictitious citizens. Let's give them some of their own medicine so they understand what seniors are going through. Rose is 72. Inflation is nipping at her heels. She can't afford groceries anymore. Gas prices are keeping her from getting out and about. Her taxes went through the roof in the last property assessment because of the real estate bubble. If she were 75, she'd get almost $1,000 more a year in OAS. But since she's 72, she gets nothing. Why are the Liberals turning their back on her? The Honourable Minister. Madam Speaker, our seniors are an absolute priority for the Government of Canada, and we've made very significant investments on their behalf. I'd like to ask my colleagues, since housing is a priority for Quebecers and access to housing is a priority and fighting climate change is a priority for Quebecers, and since electrification of vehicles and economic growth are priorities for the Bloc Québécois, why are they voting against all that? The Honourable Member for Joliette. There's not a cent for seniors in this budget. Let's talk about housing. Imagine a Quebecer who's looking for a one-bedroom apartment in July but can't afford the $1,600 rent. He doesn't have access to affordable housing because the federal government has invested only 6% of the money in Quebec. And he sees in the budget that the federal government will backload until after the next election 97% of its spending on apartment construction and 91% of the investment in housing infrastructure. It'll be years before he sees the impact of the budget measures. And that's only if the Conservatives don't reverse them completely. Why not put the money up now? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Madam Speaker, I'm looking at everything we're doing in housing, for example, building new housing, accelerated construction, the construction of affordable housing, helping young families in need, helping young families, young couples get access to property. And the Bloc is today saying that's important, but they're voting against everything we're doing. The Conservatives have so much influence over the Bloc that they keep voting along with them. It's shameful.
Honour Member for Yellowhead.
After 9 years, this NDP Liberal government has hit Canadians with another carbon tax increase of 23%. Grocery prices are climbing, making families choose between heating and eating. Conservatives tried to ease this burden by passing Bill C-234, which axes the tax on farmers. But this week, the Liberals blocked it. They are hell-bent on making life more expensive. If they're so confident in their costly plan, will they let Canadians decide and call for a carbon tax election?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, I want to be clear about the affordability piece to the way the carbon price works, because it's a carbon price and a carbon rebate. And I believe that the members opposite should be very clear with their constituents about whether they're asking the carbon rebates to not land in their bank accounts. Again, going back to what the economists state, an economist reviewed the carbon pricing and rebate system and said, we estimate that the median annual net cost of carbon taxes for households in Ontario in 2023 was negative, meaning that most households received $300 more in rebates than they paid in carbon taxes.
The Honourable Member for Simcoe Grey.
Madam Speaker, after 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, they spend more servicing the national debt than on health care. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, Canadian soldiers eat at food banks and veterans are living in their cars. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, seniors can't afford to eat and they can't afford to heat. After 9 years, Madam Speaker, despite deficit after deficit and record debt, the problems are getting worse. Canadians know the Prime Minister is not worth the cost. When will the NDP Liberal government admit they have a spending problem, not a revenue problem?
L'Honorable Ministre.
The Honourable Minister.
Madam Speaker, that's a bit rich coming from the party opposite. Let's take a walk down memory lane. When they were in party, when the Conservative Party of Canada was in party under Stephen Harper, let's see what they did to veterans. They slashed the Veterans Affairs budget. They closed 9 Veterans Affairs offices, and also they cut the workforce by 1,000 individuals that provided direct services to veterans. Mr. Speaker, we'll take no lessons from the Conservative Party of Canada.
L'Honorable Député de Shannon. Leamington.
Madam Speaker, after the release of the tax and spend budget this week, everyone knows that this NDP Liberal government, after 9 long years, and this Prime Minister are just not worth the cost. Bill C-234 was to provide some desperately needed relief for our farmers who produce food for Canadians. That bill passed this chamber. Then the Prime Minister bullied the senators into gutting that bill and leaving Canadians with higher costs. When will the Prime Minister call for a vote on the original motion or call a carbon tax election?
Madam Speaker, if the Bill C-234 was so important in the Senate, then why 5 members of their own caucus didn't show up to vote? And by the way, they had the opportunity to debate C-234 when it comes back to the House. When we come back in 1 week, they traded 2 private members' bill. It wasn't C-234. So it's so important. I would advise my member of Parliament or my colleague to lobby his particular colleagues and stop politicizing this issue.
The honourable member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Madam Speaker, this government's liberal inflationary policies have made everything more expensive. Gas has gone up so much, food is unaffordable, Canadians are hungry, and their housing is too expensive. The Canadian dream of owning a home is now out of reach for a generation of hardworking young adults. Madam Speaker, will a policy of $1 of savings for each dollar of new programs be implemented by this inflationary government? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
We work hard every day to deliver for Canadians. Conservatives pretend to care. They've already said they'll vote against the budget this year. How cruel and heartless do you have to be to vote against feeding hungry kids, or giving seniors the dental coverage they need to get their teeth fixed, or supporting people with disabilities with hundreds of dollars tax-free more per month, or building more child care spaces so parents can get back to work, or providing insulin to people living with diabetes? You can't vote against those things if you actually cared. They don't care.
So true. The honourable member for Victoria.
Madam Speaker, the Liberals should never have bought the Trans Mountain Pipeline. It threatens our climate and our coasts. And Canadian taxpayers are now on the hook for this government's irresponsible spending to the tune of $35 billion. Liberals ignored the calls from environmentalists and coastal Indigenous nations, instead choosing to be in the pocket of big oil and gas. Why does this government keep backing big polluters when they know this pipeline is an environmental and economic disaster?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
If Canada is to succeed, Madam Speaker, we know that we have to get our resources to market, and that's why the TMX pipeline is so important. But the member knows, or ought to know, that the government does not intend to be the long-term owner of the project. A divestment process will be initiated once the project is more advanced, de-risked, and essentially with consultations, and essentially when consultations with Indigenous peoples are completed. This is the vision that we've always laid out, and it's one that we'll stick to.
The honourable member for Nunavut.
In their budget on Thursday, the Liberals made a lot of announcements on housing, but they did not make the $600 million investment in the territories that Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and the Yukon have been desperately asking for. When I go home, I'm told more heartbreaking stories of crumbling and overcrowded homes. Why won't the minister listen to the territorial premiers and give them the funding they need to address the housing crisis?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for her question. She's been a strong advocate on housing across the Arctic and northern regions. We're the first government ever in history to have direct agreements with Indigenous governments to address their housing needs. We have invested billions of dollars, in fact, over $3 billion in housing across the territories in a number of ways to help increase the housing and ensure that people have housing that is affordable to them.
Climate change means more flooding events of increasing intensity and severity. Homeowners in areas prone to flooding, like those in parts of Pierrefonds in my riding hit by flooding in 2017 and 2019, worry about the rising cost of flood insurance, and that's if they're lucky enough to remain eligible for flood insurance coverage. Can the Minister of Emergency Preparedness tell this House how this week's budget is coming to the aid of climate-vulnerable homeowners.
The Honourable Minister of Emergency Preparedness.
Madam Speaker, I want to thank the member for his very strong advocacy on flood protection. We know that the devastating impact that climate change is having on Canadians. Insurance companies are paying billions of dollars, and those costs are being passed on Canadians, making it even more expensive to own homes. With the budget 2024, we are increasing our investments on national low-cost flood insurance program. Over the next year, we will work with the provinces and territories to put this program in place. And, Madam Speaker, we will be there for Canadians when climate change impacts their lives. Thank you.
Honourable Member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Madam Speaker, this week the RCMP raided the home of the Prime Minister's top Arrive scammer, Christian Firth. The raid is connected to a proposal that Firth's GC Strategies sent to the Deputy Prime Minister and her former Chief of Staff, Jeremy Broadhurst. So, what communications did the Deputy Prime Minister and her office have with GC Strategies regarding a proposal that has led to an RCMP raid?
The Honourable Minister.
Madam Speaker, again, just because my colleague on the other side of the aisle repeats something doesn't necessarily attach it to the facts. The facts, Madam Speaker, in this case are well known. The RCMP, the one thing that he said is that's entirely factual, is the RCMP are looking into this matter. And that's why I would urge people to be careful before they invent things and ascribe things to what is an ongoing police investigation. Our government has said that people have a responsibility to be judicious with taxpayers' money, and those that aren't will face the consequences.
I remember St. Albert Edmonton.
Madam Speaker, the two-person basement company GC Strategies received more than $100 million from this NDP government, including $20 million for nothing on Arrive scam. We know of a link between GC Strategies and the Deputy Prime Minister and her office regarding a proposal that has led to an RCMP raid. So, has the Deputy Prime Minister been contacted by the RCMP, and will she fully cooperate with the police investigation?
Again, Madam Speaker, my friend on the other side simply asserts a series of things that he knows very well are not accurate and attempts to connect a series of dots that simply can't be connected.
Yeah, that's obvious.
He should stick to the basic facts. The RCMP, following information that was given to them by the Border Services Agency, has decided to look into a series of allegations. They obviously take their work very seriously, and we should allow Canada's National Police Force to do their work and not simply make up stuff in the House of Commons beside the work that they're doing.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Regina, Wascana.
Madam Speaker, after 9 years of this Liberal NDP government, this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost or the corruption. The ArriveCan app was originally supposed to cost $80,000, only to skyrocket to $60 million, triggering an RCMP investigation. The contractor admitted to this House that he does not feel ashamed, and the Liberals have not even asked him to repay the money. Madam Speaker, when will the Prime Minister get Canadians their money back?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Madam Speaker, I had a chance earlier in today's question period to answer that question. I'm happy to do it again. Madam Speaker, our government has worked with the Auditor General's office, with parliamentary committees. There's an internal investigation being conducted by the Border Services Agency. All of these investigations will, unlike some of our friends on the other side, establish the facts of what happened. Anybody who's misused taxpayers' money will be required to repay it, and anybody who has misused taxpayers' money will face the consequences, and that's why we're pleased that the RCMP are looking into this matter.
Honourable for Regina, Wascana.
But, Madam Speaker, this app went live 4 years ago in the early days of the pandemic and has been the subject of questioning and scrutiny ever since. While Canadians were losing their businesses and being told by this Prime Minister that we were all in this together, insiders at GC Strategies were milking taxpayers for millions of dollars. Madam Speaker, when will the Prime Minister get taxpayers their money back on Arrive scam?
The Honourable Minister.
Madam Speaker, we have said continually, and we'll say it again, if people have misused taxpayers' money or have misappropriated public funds, Of course, efforts will be undertaken to recuperate that money. That's what a responsible government does. But a responsible government, Madam Speaker, allows the internal reviews and audits that are underway to determine exactly what money might be subject to the reimbursement and what's the appropriate process to have that money reimbursed. And at the same time, Madam Speaker, the RCMP are also looking into this matter.
The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher-les-Patriotes-Verchères. Madam Speaker, gas went up by 15 cents in one single shot on Thursday morning. It's highway robbery. And that's not because of the carbon tax, which doesn't apply in Quebec and didn't change Thursday morning. Why did it actually happen? Because of these greedy oil companies. They're getting ready for summer by taking money out of people's pockets. Companies like Suncor and CNRL, which raked in $8 billion in profits last year, and yet they're being subsidized by the Liberals. Over 10 years, $83 billion. The Liberals also bought a $34 billion pipeline. Isn't it time to cut off the money for these oil companies? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Madam Speaker, the oil and gas sector has to pay its fair share. It's bringing in record profits and needs to invest in reducing emissions. We have eliminated inefficient subsidies to fossil fuels. And we're asking the wealthiest 1% to pay a little more. The Conservatives are against our cap on oil and gas emissions. The Conservatives, in fact, are taking their marching orders from the oil and gas sector. Order. The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher-les-Patriotes-Verchères. Well, I think that the Liberals are going to have to tell us what an efficient subsidy to the oil and gas sector would even be. Now, the carbon tax doesn't apply in Quebec and has only a 0.15% impact on inflation. But Conservatives from Quebec are constantly weeping and wailing about it, whereas when gas goes up by 15 cents due to their fossil fuel friends, they don't say a word. There's complete silence when the oil and gas companies take money out of Quebecers' pockets. Same thing when we say that the government should stop paying fossil fuel companies. Does this government think that it's a good thing that they pay through the nose to these oil and gas companies, and yet these companies make consumers pay more? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Madam Speaker, I'm glad we're hearing the truth from the Bloc Québécois, which is that the federal carbon tax, the federal carbon price does not apply in Quebec. They should speak to the Conservatives who don't seem to understand this. We agree that all sectors of the economy need to reduce emissions, including oil and gas companies. We are doing that work to ensure that it happens. The Honourable Member for... No, not the Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher-les-Patriotes-Verchères. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I meant to say Montmagny-Lisley-Kamouraska-Rivière-du-Loup. Madam Speaker, Canadians are struggling to put food on the table. Meanwhile, this Prime Minister's ArriveCan app has made the GC Strategies owners multi-millionaires. Canadians could have gotten some answers about ArriveCan this week, but instead the Prime Minister enforced silence and ignored Canadians' questions. This is $60 million in taxpayer money that went into the pockets of millionaires. Will the PM give Canadians this wasted money back? The Honourable Minister of Transport. No, I'm sorry.
No, l'honorable ministre.
No, there's the Minister of Transport over here. I'm not the Minister of Transport. Now, Madam Speaker, thank you. As my colleague knows, it's simply not true that the government wasn't transparent. My colleague keeps saying that, but he knows it's not true. I've been working with parliamentary committees. We've been working with the Auditor General. We completely agree with the idea that all those who inappropriately receive taxpayer money will have to pay it back. And as my colleague knows, the RCMP is investigating this matter. The Honourable Member, Madam Speaker, at a time when Canadians are working so hard without being able to actually get appropriately compensated for their work, consultants involved in the ArriveCan disaster received $60 million. That's taxpayer money. Taxpayer money that was wasted. And they got that money for doing no work. So Canadians have a simple question, and the answer should also be simple. When will the Prime Minister give taxpayers their money back? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Madam Speaker, as I said in English a few moments ago, my colleague knows that there's an inquiry happening at the CBSA, an internal inquiry, and it's for that exact purpose, to find out whether money was spent inappropriately. We're going to have to wait to understand what the facts are before asking for money to be paid back. We understand Canadians' concerns about this. We share Canadians' concerns about using taxpayer money appropriately.
Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister's Arrive Scam app was supposed to cost $80,000. The Prime Minister chose the app, mandated its use, and along with the NDP voted $60 million to fund it. Shady contractors got rich without doing any IT work, while the app itself failed and erroneously sent tens of thousands of Canadians into quarantine. The RCMP are knocking. The main contractors got $20 million. When will the Prime Minister get Canadians their money back?
L'Honorable Ministre.
Madam Speaker, the same question begets the same answer. We've said from the beginning the government has welcomed the scrutiny of parliamentary committees, worked with the Auditor General, and implemented her recommendations. My colleague, the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, has changed the way that these contracts are awarded and the oversight provisions. We'll continue to do what's necessary to ensure taxpayers' money is well spent, and we'll continue to obviously hold those to account that don't follow the rules.
L'Honorable député de Ottawa-Vanier.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Nos vétérans et leurs familles.
The Honourable Member for Ottawa-Vanier. Madam Speaker, our veterans and their families have sacrificed a great deal for our country. We have a solemn, sacred duty to support our veterans who served with honor and courage. We know that it can be difficult for a veteran transitioning to civilian life to access medical care. When they were in the armed forces, veterans received their health care from the forces directly. Can the Minister for Veterans tell us how she will help veterans and their family have access to these services? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my friend and colleague for her important question and her hard work for veterans in her community. Budget 2024 will increase support to veterans and their families. Telemedicine services throughout the country will be offered to veterans and their families. That is one of the significant measures for veterans in this new budget. The pilot project has been a success. Broadening these programs will help veterans access health care during their transition to civilian life. Our government will always be there to support veterans and their families. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Madam Speaker, after 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, Canada has entered uncharted territory. This government has made Canada a candy store for car thieves, and under their watch, organised crime has made Canada a key exporter of deadly fentanyl. Canadians and now the whole world know that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. This NDP Liberal government must take responsibility for this failure, which has brought crime, chaos, and corruption not only to Canadian streets, but the streets of the whole world. Perhaps is there a Liberal Party leadership candidate who can rise and tell us who's been running this place for the past 9 years so we can hold them to account.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Look, fear-mongering does nothing to encourage Canadians to have more confidence in our justice system. We have one of the safest countries in the entire world. We had an auto summit just a few short months ago where we brought all of the different parties together. Since that time, you've seen an increase in the measures taken by police and other authorities across the country, including the federal government, and car theft is going down and recovering of stolen cars is going up. These measures continue to work, and we will continue to work with other levels of government and other necessary authorities. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
L'honorable député de Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam Speaker, this Liberal government has been in power for 9 years. We all know this, but I will repeat it. This government is not worth the cost. Montreal is turning into the Wild West. Criminals just don't care about authority. In fact, on Wednesday, some car thieves actually tried to run over police officers. Should that really be the case in a civilized country like Canada? Will the Prime Minister of this Liberal Bloc Québécois coalition, Will this Prime Minister finally put an end to these lax crime policies and put these reoffending auto thieves in prison? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Madam Speaker, one of the pieces of good news in the budget, of which there were many, and my colleague knows this very well, is that my colleague, the Minister of Justice, has committed to making amendments to the criminal code. Specifically for that purpose, to change penalties for car thieves, as my colleague is saying. We have had discussions with our essential partners to prevent auto theft, and we will continue to do all that is necessary to prevent this problem.
Prince George.
Since 2016, over 40,000 Canadians have died from overdose. Over $1 billion has been spent with zero results. BC's Deputy Commissioner of the RCMP has confirmed that organized crime is indeed trafficking safe supply. It's going straight from the pharmacy to the hands of criminals, unleashing crime, chaos, and disorder in our communities. After 9 years of this Prime Minister and his NDP servants, Canadians are finding out that they're not worth the cost. When will the Minister of Safe Supply take responsibility for her failed drug policies and put an end to taxpayer-funded drug policies?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire de la ministre de la Famille, des Enfants et du Développement social.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We need all partners working together to address the illegal toxic drug supply in our communities. We have and we will continue to support provinces and territories so that they can deliver the full suite resources that are needed. Our government will use every tool at our disposal to end this national public health crisis.
The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Madam Speaker, Canada's support for Ukraine has been unwavering. Unlike the Conservative Party opposite, which has voted against Ukraine multiple times now, we are stepping up our support through Budget 2024. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development please tell this House about the important news for Ukraine through the latest budget?
Hear, hear. Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development.
Our government has been there since day one for Ukraine. Budget 2024 is yet another step in making sure that Ukraine wins in its fight against Putin's illegal invasion. This budget includes almost $3 billion in additional financing, including for lethal and non-lethal weapons, including funding through the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development for the reconstruction of Ukraine, and we'll see how we can use seized Russian assets for the restoration of Ukraine. We have always been there to support Ukraine.
Hear, hear. The honourable member Churchill, Kiwana, Newcastle.
Madam Speaker, the NDP successfully fought against cuts to Indigenous services, but it's clear the Liberals still don't get it. Let's look at housing and infrastructure, where the Liberals spent less than 1% of what First Nations need. First Nations here in Manitoba face a serious infrastructure crisis, but this government still delays helping them, preferring to pat themselves on the back for just not being conservatives. Will the Liberals commit to partner with Manitoba First Nations to build the infrastructure they desperately need, including on the airport in Wasagamak and the desperately needed East Side All-Weather Road?
The Honourable Minister of Indigenous Services.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for her ongoing advocacy. Since 2015, we've increased spending on Indigenous priorities by 180%. That's right, Madam Speaker. That's the abysmal state that we received this file in 2015 from a previous Harper Conservatives who gave zero cares about the lives of Indigenous people. In fact, Budget 2024 dedicates over $9.5 billion to Indigenous priorities. A full 25% of the budget goes towards Indigenous priorities in this country. We'll continue on the path of reconciliation together.
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Madam Speaker, in the midst of a climate crisis, the oil and gas industry raked in $38 billion in pure profit in 2022 by gouging Canadians at the pumps, fueling inflation. And despite claims of fairness in this year's budget, we learned this week that big oil's lobbyists convinced this government to shelve an excess profit tax on these record-breaking profits that could have generated $4.2 billion to help make life more affordable for regular Canadians. Can anyone in this government justify to Canadians what's fair about this?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would remind the member what I said earlier when the NDP posed the question on this issue. Introducing eliminating inefficient fossil fuel subsidies and introducing a tax on share buybacks. In addition, changes to capital gains that will benefit, on the whole, the vast majority of small businesses in this country by decreasing the inclusionary rate and increasing the lifetime capital gains exemption means that it's the largest corporations that will be asked to pay more to ensure a greater vision of fairness in the country.
Good. And that brings us to the end of question period on this Friday. I have a point of order. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I understand that over the constituency week, the Speaker has indicated that he's going to be reviewing some of the things that have been said in the House to further improve decorum here. I would just like to contribute to that, the reflection that he will be doing. And I'm going to reference Standing Order 18 specifically. Standing Order 18 specifically says, no member shall speak disrespectfully of the sovereign, nor any of the royal family, nor the Governor General, or the person administering the Government of Canada, nor use offensive words against either House or against any other member thereof. No member may reflect upon any vote, and it goes on. My point is, Madam Speaker, today during question period, the member from Regina Wascana, although he did it today, it's been done a number of times in this House, has referred to the Prime Minister as corrupt and to the government as corrupt. I would say that that terminology specifically goes against Standing Order 18. I would encourage the Chair, during this time of reflection over that week that he indicated he was going to do that, to consider my comment on this and to weigh into whether or not this is actually they keep yelling debate. This is one of the few times I'm actually rising on a point of order that actually is a point of order. But
point of order on information that's been to be provided to the Speaker.
If you could reflect on that, Speaker, and include that in your deliberations and reporting back to the House, whether or not the word corrupt in reference to an individual or the government is appropriate. Thank you.
It's taken up. The Honourable Member for Saskatoon University on the point of order.
Yes, Madam Speaker. If you ask the Ethics Commissioner about all the infractions that this Prime Minister has been charged and convicted with on corruption, you will find the truth to be that this is a corrupt government and Prime Minister.
Point of debate now. The Honourable Member was rising on a specific word to provide the Honourable Minister. Un autre point de débat.
Another point of debate? Another point of order? The Honourable Member for Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to reinforce what my colleague just said. Madam Speaker, I would like to make a point of order to this effect yesterday to the Speaker who was in the chair. So he needs to establish clear guidelines and we would be better off if we had those. We would need to know our limits because currently in the recent months there's a type of lack of clarity on the matter, and so when MPs step outside of the lines, we should know so. I would encourage the Speaker's office to come back to us after the break week to tell us, give us more clear guidelines, and that will help guide our interventions in the House.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I wanted to stress that the discussions, the decisions that the Speaker will have to make in the next few days needs to include, as the Conservatives raised yesterday, the use of false titles. We have the Conservatives repeatedly using during question period false titles, talking about in English an NDP Liberal government, talking in French about a Bloc Liberal government. This is a false and misleading use of false titles, and it is something very much that wasn't permitted certainly during the Harper government in the House of Commons, should not be permitted now.
I appreciate another point of order. The Honourable Member for Portage-Lisgar, yes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd just like to add, as you move forward with your deliberations on this, that given we had a historic event happen earlier this week with historic corruption once again in this country, combined with the numerous ethics violations, that corruption is an appropriate word for this Prime Minister.
So I think that that's more of a point of debate, and I want to remind members that if they're raising on points of order, that it should be actually on the point of order and not a debate. The honourable member for Edmonton-Wetaskiwin is also rising on a point of order.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Speaker. As I'm listening to this, today in question period, we heard Liberal members repeatedly refer to Conservative members of Parliament as mean and cruel. If we're going to go down the road of listing, I'm sure we could sit here, we could scour the member from Kingston and the Islands record with all sorts of language that he's used that we might not agree with. I would just urge the chair that as the office is deliberating on this list, that list of things we can't say in this House of Commons be as short as possible, that we have latitude to engage in our democracy freely and passionately on behalf of our constituents, because I am concerned that we are going down a road where we have way too many things that we are not able to talk about freely, and I don't think that our democracy is helped by that.
I appreciate that point of order as well, and so I do appreciate all that was contributed today. We'll certainly take that under advisement. Point of clarification, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In my response to the member for Nunavut during question period, I just want to clarify for the record that we have invested close to $1.2 billion across the 3 territories in housing and supported over 18,000 units. And in budget 2024, we invested an additional $918 million in housing in the territories.
Tabling of documents, dépôt de documents, the Honourable Secretary, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and to the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources.
Madam Speaker, I have the honour to table in both official languages the agreement entitled Agreement between the Government of Canada and the United Nations as presented by the United Nations Environment Programme regarding the 4th session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, INC 4, done at Nairobi on April 4th, 2024.
Dépôt de documents.
Tabling of documents. Introduction of government bills. Statements by ministers. Reports from interparliamentary delegations. Presenting reports from committees. I recognize the honourable member from Malpeque virtually.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to present in both official languages the following 2 reports of the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. The 11th report, entitled Bill C-26, an act respecting cybersecurity, amending the Telecommunications Act and making consequential amendments to other acts. The committee has studied the bill and has decided to report the bill back to the House with amendments. And the 12th report in relation to motion adopted on Monday, April 15th, 2024, regarding modification to the National Occupational Classification of Firefighters. Pursuant to the Standing Order 109, the committee requests that government table a comprehensive response to the 12th report. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de rapports de comité.
Presenting reports from committees. Introduction of private members' bills. First reading of Senate public bills. Motions. Presenting petitions. I recognize the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Today to present a petition from Canadians and people from the Nipissing area who are concerned about upcoming changes in legislation related to the medical assistance in dying maid.
The petitioners call upon the House of Commons to reverse the law extending eligibility for MAID to people with mental illness and their as a sole medical condition. Les pétitionnaires demandent à la Chambre.
The petitions are asking the House of Commons to reduce access to medical assistance in dying for those diagnosed solely with a medical illness. Presenting of petitions, the Honourable Member for Port Wellington.
Mr. Speaker, good to see you in the chair. Today I'm pleased to present a petition on behalf of petitioners in the riding of Perth-Wellington. The petitioners request that the government institute a citizens' assembly on electoral reform. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de pétition.
Presenting petitions. I recognize the Honourable Member from Nanaimo, Lady Smith.
To present a petition, I want to first thank the Canadian Alliance of British Pensioners, in particular Ian Andexter, who is a constituent in my riding. Mr. Speaker, over 113,000 British pensioners living in Canada are currently receiving a frozen UK pension. In the last 2 years, the UK state pension has increased 18.6% to keep up with inflation, yet British pensioners in Canada are receiving 0%. Canada annually indexes the CPP for Canadians who live in the UK, so there is no reciprocity. Recently, the UK sought the support of Canada to join the CPTPP, which was willingly given, and yet Canada has requested an end to this one-sided arrangement 5 times in the last 10 years. Overall, Mr. Speakers, I know I'm running out of time. The undersigned citizens and residents of Canada who receive a UK pension or will be eligible to draw a UK pension in the future call upon the Government of Canada to seek a meeting with officials in the UK government to negotiate a standalone social security agreement to include uprating of UK pensions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
Présentation de pétition.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable, Parliamentary Secretary and Member for Ottawa West Nepean.
Table petition E4758. The petitioners are calling on the Government of Canada, particularly IRCC, to develop a list of laws that are known in repressive regimes like Russia to be used to persecute human rights defenders, democracy activists, and political dissidents. The petitioners are concerned that such laws, if they're deemed to have a Canadian equivalent, could be used to make someone inadmissible to Canada on the basis of a conviction just for defending human rights. I'd like to thank my constituent Maria Kartasheva, who is a new Canadian citizen, for bringing forward this petition to make sure that what happened to her never happens to anyone else. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Member for Chatham-Kent, Leamington.
Mr. Speaker, I bring forward a petition to the attention of this chamber, spearheaded by the St. Michael's Roman Catholic Women's League, based out of Bridgetown, though many other Canadians have signed it. And they want to draw attention to the fact that the depiction of sexual violence and the access, particularly from young people, is far too easy in this country. It's not protected by any effective age verification methods. And so they want to make this House fully aware that this is an important health and public safety concern, and therefore they are encouraging us to adopt Bill S-210, which would protect young persons from exposure to pornography. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de pétition. Nous allons de façon.
Presenting petitions virtually, the Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This petition I'm tabling is for the Government of Canada to apologize for Black Canadians for its royal and chattel enslavement in Canada. Specifically, 4 items are noted. Chattel enslavement was initiated over 400 years ago to assemble a cheap, ready, usable workforce who were dehumanized and dispersed globally. Second, in colonial Canada, King Louis XIV's Code Noir became law in 1743, which required both Indigenous and Black slaves brought into the French colony to be considered the possessions of those who purchased them. 3, Great Britain further supported the practice of chattel enslavement after the French in 1759. And 4th, the following Slavery Abolition Act in 1834, and after the Dominion of Canada was created in 1867, systemic racism continued, thereby perpetuating the practice, discriminating beliefs in society, institutions, organizations, and legislations which treated blacks as marginal and inferior. Therefore, these petitioners are calling on the Government of Canada to finally do the right thing and apologize to Black Canadians for their centuries of mistreatment and racism in Canada. And I thank Elise Harding-Davis for bringing this petition forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de pétition, l'honorable.
The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
You know, just recently, WestJet announced new flights, new international flights, along with some domestic flights, one of them being direct to Ottawa, for example. But it's encouraging when international airlines actually expand services, and that's what this petition is all about, Mr. Speaker. What they're asking for is to have airliners take a look at, along with the government, at ways in which we can enhance flight services, direct flight services to Europe in particular, India, Mr. Speaker, ideally, and I speak to WestJet and others to encourage them to consider looking at those direct flights from Winnipeg to India direct. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de pétition, l'honorable député de North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to rise today and present a number of petitions on behalf of members of the North Okanagan, Shuswap, and Canadians. The first one being stating that whereas Canadians with mental health issues should be provided with treatment and support, and mental illness can be complex and can include suicidal thoughts and symptoms. Therefore, the undersigned citizens and residents of Canada call upon the House of Commons to reverse the law extending eligibility for MAID to people with mental illness as their sole medical condition. The next petition I have is again signed by residents of the North Okanagan, Shuswap, and Canadians, stating that sexually explicit material, including demeaning material and material depicting sexual violence, can easily be accessed on the internet by young persons. They therefore call on the petitioners call on the House of Commons to adopt Bill S-210, protecting young persons from exposure to pornography. The final three petitions, Mr. Speaker, again, I've rising numerous times on this issue. They present the petitions because they're concerned about the way this Liberal NDP government has overreached into their lives, especially when it comes to access to natural health products. The petitioners call on the Minister of Health to work with the natural health products industry and adjust Health Canada's cost recovery rates to accurately reflect the clear operations be run smoothly. Thank you.
Présentation de pétition, l'honorable député de Victoria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising because nearly 2,000 signatories are calling on the government to uphold and protect abortion rights in Canada. Conservative members have presented anti-abortion legislation, and with the rise of anti-abortion legislation in the United States, Canadians must be vigilant in upholding this vital right. The lives of women and gender minorities rely on access to safe and legal abortions. I'm also presenting a paper to petition where constituents have signed on the topic of the mistreatment and discrimination that people experiencing homelessness and the unhoused populations face. While government is funding NGOs and providing the funding, petitioners are calling for housing-first solutions and are concerned about the violence that this population faces from police and other people with more power. The petition calls on the House of Commons to implement a federal law against discrimination against homeless people in Canada and to make it illegal to confiscate their property. Mr. Speaker, I'm rising to present a petition with well over 500 signatures. The right to bargain is a constitutional right, and the petitioners are calling on the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority to cease interference with industrial relations and allow the contractors to meet their duties as an employer, to reverse the decision by CATSA to disqualify 27 screening officers at the Victoria Airport. These workers were unjustly terminated without due process. They are asking for justice.
Présentation de pétition, l'honorable député de Kingston-Leasel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have two petitions to present today. The first is on behalf of constituents who are calling to the attention of the government, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who have warned us repeatedly that rising temperatures over the next 2 decades will bring widespread devastation and extreme weather. And these petitions are specifically calling on the government of Canada to move forward immediately with bold emissions caps for the oil and gas sector that are comprehensive in scope and realistic in achieving the necessary targets that Canada has set to reduce emissions by 2030. The second petition I'm presenting today, Mr. Speaker, actually is from a bunch of farmers in the, primarily from the riding to the north of mine, which is Lanark Frontenac Kingston. These are farmers that are bringing to the attention of the government that the abattoir that was located at the Joyceville institution was shut down a number of months ago, and as a result, there's no longer options to utilize an abattoir within a local area of Kingston, and as such, these farmers have to bring their cattle to abattoirs that are a much further distance away. So they're calling on the government of Canada to explore all options to ensure that the abattoir located at Joyceville Institution is reopened to address the issues noted above.
Présentation de pétition, l'honorable député de Calgary, Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad I finally caught your eye. So I'm tabling two petitions today on behalf of constituents in my riding. The first petition calls on the federal government, which has already issued sanctions against the Russian Federation, to also name the Russian Federation as a foreign state supporting terrorism and to list them as a state sponsor of terror under specific legislation related to terrorism and the State Immunity Act as well. The second petition is one very dear to my heart because I'm a member of the Calgary Co-op. The Government of Canada has outlawed, made illegal, single-use plastics across the country as of December 2023, including Calgary Co-op's 100% compostable shopping bags. This is despite the fact that the Calgary Co-op states that their bags contain no plastic, including no plastic in the ink. And those plastic bags, those non-plastic bags, are engineered to break down at the local composting facility that the City of Calgary owns within a 28-day time frame. There is no waste, no plastic. Calgary Co-op says their bags are extremely popular with their members, are often reused as bin liners for household organic waste, constituting a second use. And Calgary Co-op has successfully kept over 100 million plastic bags out of landfills with the use of their compostable shopping bags. They're also signaling to the Government of Canada that this is an unnecessary ban that could send signals that stifle the adoption and development of environmentally responsible products. Therefore, the petitioners are asking for the following: that the Government of Canada recognize that compostable bags do not constitute single-use plastic and are therefore worthy of an exemption for this ban. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de pétition.
Presenting petitions.
Question inscrite au feuille.
Questions on the order paper.
Parlementaire.
The Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Questions be allowed to stand at this time, please.
Ordre du jour.
Orders of the day. Orders of the day, government orders, government bills, commons, resuming debate of a motion on Senate amendments to Bill C-29, an act to provide for the establishment of a National Council for Reconciliation. Resuming debate virtually, the member for Churchill, Kiwatanuk, Askin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
To debate Bill C-29, an act to provide for the establishment of a National Council of Reconciliation. If enacted, this would ensure a nonpartisan, arm's-length organization that would hold the government of the day to its commitments to reconciliation. It's needed because every year this government shows less and less of a commitment to reconciliation. Let's look at the Liberal record. Last year, not one Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendation was implemented. Out of the 94 calls to action, only 13 have been accomplished. The government promised to end long-term boiled water advisories more than 3 years ago, and there's still no end in sight. But this year is looking even worse. What's happened with this government's most important relationship, you might ask? Well, just look at this past week. The Minister of Finance couldn't even bring herself to utter the words Indigenous or reconciliation in her speech introducing the budget. But why would she, given her rhetoric over the last year? Indigenous peoples spent months hearing this government threaten sunsetting and cuts to the services that they and their communities rely on. Programs and grants that were threatened, including Jordan's Principle, and dealing with the harmful legacy of residential schools. Programs and services people rely on. It took NDP pressure to reverse many of those cuts. But this is how low the bar is held with this government, opposing cuts in the face of a $350 billion infrastructure gap. Instead of proposing a wealth tax or an excess profit tax on people like Mirko Bibic, Galen Weston, or Arthur Irving, This government consciously chose to spend less than 1% of what's needed to end the housing crisis on First Nations. Despite all their bluster, Big Oil doesn't need to beg this government for handouts. Galen Weston certainly doesn't. Bell gets all the money they need so they can give it away in fat bonuses and shareholder dividends while laying off thousands of workers. Yet First Nations are treated as an afterthought in this budget. It really boggles the mind. This government recently co-authored a report that made clear how badly federal governments, whether liberal or conservatives, have just fundamentally failed First Nations. How if you doubled the number of homes in First Nations communities, there still wouldn't be enough to meet the housing demand. And upon releasing the report with the AFN, the Liberals decided to completely ignore it. The Liberals know they won't hit the 2030 goal to end the housing crisis for First Nations. Their department officials have admitted as much. But not Liberal MPs, not the ministers responsible, or the Prime Minister will admit it. Communities like the ones here in northern Manitoba live this reality every day. They know it well. That's why Grand Chief Kathy Merrick said in response to this week's budget that it will be a, quote, cold day in hell before the infrastructure gap facing First Nations is ended, end quote. That's why the AFN and National Chief Woodhouse is calling for a First Minister's meeting this year to discuss a path forward on reconciliation because the government just isn't getting the work done. So let's be honest what a $350 billion infrastructure gap looks like. Shamattawa First Nation, where the housing crisis is so bad, they've had to deal with the tuberculosis outbreaks. In fact, here in northern Manitoba, over the last number of years, we've had higher rates of tuberculosis than some parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Or how about Tatasquiat Cree Nation, where this government had so fundamentally failed delivering clean water, they had to fight the First Nation in court. Pimichikamak Cree Nation, where there's a 2,000 family wait list for homes. Nisichawasik Cree Nation, that has 700 home waiting list. Or how about Wasagamak? That's still one of the most isolated communities in the country, still waiting for the federal government to step up and work with them and the province to build a desperately needed airport. Communities on the east side of Manitoba, on the east side of Lake Winnipeg, that are paying the price of climate change, that have no choice but to rely on ice roads that are increasingly unreliable because of a shortened winter season, who've made it clear to the federal government they need all-weather roads that the federal government has made no commitment to working with them to help build. Or the Island Lake region, with a similar population to my hometown of Thompson, thousands of people living in the Island Lake region that still don't have a hospital or an all-weather road. The housing infrastructure gap, and I would call crisis, is so pervasive in First Nations here in Manitoba and for many First Nations across the country. Communities need housing, elders' care homes, daycares, health centers, water treatment plants, emergency preparedness-related infrastructure. They need to improve existing roads and build new ones so that they can have a fight to survive climate change. Many of these stories are rooted here in my constituency in northern Manitoba on the east side of Lake Winnipeg, but we know it is repeated across the country. Indigenous peoples are almost 3 times more likely to live in a home in need of major repair. More than half of First Nations don't have regular access to high-speed internet, and roughly 15% have none at all. We need to be honest with ourselves. This is keeping Indigenous communities poor, and it is a choice by the federal government. Every tax loophole this government looks the other way on, every time we buy fridges for Galen Weston or give billions of dollars to Big Oil, that's money we're not spending on people and communities who need it most. And the sad reality is this government only steps up when they're court-ordered to do so. In fact, Budget 2024 outlined $57 billion in settlement money as if it's this huge success from the government and not a situation where they fought First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people every step of the way on to deny them justice. It's clear the government is laying the groundwork for future class action lawsuits, to be honest, against them. One can only imagine what's coming on the housing front. The Auditor General recently released a report on the housing crisis on reserve, and it came out that Indigenous Services has been using the wrong census data from 2001, effectively robbing First Nations, particularly in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, from the housing dollars that they deserve, up to $250 million. Did the Minister of Indigenous Services or the Prime Minister rush to right that wrong, to get that money into the hands of communities that had a right to it? No. Instead, the Prime Minister refused to even entertain the idea that they ever would when he was asked about it. Another example of this government fundamentally failing First Nations, and one that will likely end in a class action lawsuit against them. A class action lawsuit they deeply deserve. On the other hand, we have a Conservative Party that never saw a tax break for billionaires they didn't love. The last time the leader of the official opposition was in government, the Conservatives gave away $60 billion. The Conservatives gave away $60 billion in corporate tax cuts. Pardon me. And on the day the previous Prime Minister delivered a public apology to survivors of residential school systems years ago, the current Conservative leader...
I hate to interrupt the Honourable Member, but there's a point of order here in the House, so I recognize the Honourable Member.
Speaker, and while I rise for a brief point of order, just perhaps the Honourable Member will have an opportunity to get a glass of water, but I'm just wondering if you can confirm how much time in the member's intervention she has remaining before the end of her speech.
I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes. On behalf of the member who currently had the floor and on behalf of everyone, there's 11 minutes left and 5 seconds for this debate. So the member, I'll keep talking for a few more moments to ensure that the member is ready to resume her speech. So the Honourable Member for Churchill has 11 minutes left for her speech. Thank you.
And on the day the previous Prime Minister delivered a public apology to survivors of residential schools years ago, the current Conservative leader, the leader of the official opposition, said he wasn't sure, quote, Canada was getting value for all this money, unquote. Money being spent to compensate survivors, and that his view was that, quote, we need to engender the values of hard work and independence and self-reliance. That's the solution in the long run. More money will not solve it, end quote. I challenge the leader of the official opposition to come to First Nations like the ones that I represent, where kids were abused, where kids died, where families are still dealing with the poisonous and destructive legacy of the residential school system. I challenge the leader of the official opposition to look people in the face and say that Canada is the victim here, that Canada is the one that didn't get its value. Shame on him. Yet it's not just him that doesn't understand the harmful legacy of residential schools. The reality is we're now approaching 3 years since Canadians learned what First Nations across this country already knew, the existence of mass grave sites near residential schools. Yet this government is still not supporting communities with the resources they need to bring their children home. Communities like Cross Lake and others wanted to work with the International Commission on Missing Persons, the work that has already begun. However, before it could move forward, the government ended the contract, and now Cross Lake and other communities are forced to start over. Justice delayed. Despite his claims that he wants to support communities, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations has done virtually nothing to assist First Nations who want to work with the ICMP, a global leader when it comes to uncovering mass graves. He's done virtually nothing to assist First Nations who desperately want to work to uncover the truth and bring their children home. In Sagging First Nation, an employee recently found bones while digging a trench for a water pipe to a church addition. This area wasn't part of any known cemetery. The community wants to work with the International Commission of Missing Persons. They've asked CERNAC for support, but haven't received any. People across our north see through the government's empty use of the word reconciliation. People across our north want to see action. I know we in the NDP will continue to call out this government when it fails Indigenous peoples, when it talks a good talk, especially on reconciliation, while refusing to follow through in terms of action. We're proud to support this bill, but recognize that the monitoring process or lack thereof won't create the change Indigenous peoples need to see. Here, in our part of the country, people are clear. Indigenous leaders, elders, youth, advocates are clear. What they need to see is action, an end to third world living conditions, true change in the face of the climate emergency, real investment to make life better. They deserve action, they deserve justice, and we should recognize and act on nothing less. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires. Je reconnais l'honorable député de Winnipeg Nord.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I suspect that the member is actually going to be voting in favor of C-29. I believe it is, a commitment that's being fulfilled with one of the calls for action, the 94 calls for action. And what I have found actually quite pleasing is to know that as a government, the member cannot cite any other leader of a political party that has done more to move in a substantive way than the Prime Minister of Canada has over the last 9 years. I know the moment I sit down, she's going to continue to be critical of the government, and that's what she's allowed to do, Mr. Speaker. But the reality is that on the calls for action, we have seen 80% of them being acted, many of them being completed, and this is a government that has virtually from day one made a commitment with First Nations to ensure that we move forward on the calls for action. And I guess my question to the member is quite simply, she just confirmed she's supporting the bill.
L'honorable député de Churchill-Kiwatinuk-Aski.
Well, in response to the question, I think I made clear in the speech that we are supporting the bill, but I'm not sure about the statements with respect to, the historic nature of the Prime Minister's action vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples. Look no further than the fact that the Minister of Finance didn't even say the word Indigenous once, or the word reconciliation in this week's budget, and the fact that less than 1% of what's needed was invested in First Nations housing and infrastructure, given the recently uncovered $350 billion gap, is nothing to write home about. I know this member is from Manitoba. He knows the infrastructure gap that First Nations face well. Clearly, his government's budget and ongoing approach is nowhere near what we need to see when it comes to closing the infrastructure gap for Manitobans, particularly, especially Indigenous peoples.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her speech. And, I'm not sure if she was shocked as I was, by the comments of praise given to his own government, the member from Winnipeg North. I put out again, I just want to build on what you're saying about how the word Indigenous wasn't even mentioned once by the finance minister. But the fact that they gave more money to deal with auto theft in this budget than they did to finding murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, sending a very clear message to Indigenous people that they value cars more than us. That's how crass this government has been. We know they're billions of dollars short to deal with the housing gap. We know that there continues to be boil water advisories. But I want to speak specifically about the North. We are in the middle of a climate emergency. This government's watching in real time, resources not being able to get to community, and it's becoming a crisis. They fail to act. How concerned are communities in the North about the failure of governments to deal with this growing crisis?
L'honorable député de Churchill-Kiwatinuk-Aski.
Well, thank you so much to my colleague for the question, but more importantly for her championing of the call for justice and for action for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And what a stark, I would say, condemnation of the Liberal plan to act on the crisis that is missing and murdered Indigenous women, and the fact that there's more money for stolen cars than for action on missing and murdered Indigenous women in this budget. Just absolutely shocking. To the question on the climate emergency, we're on day 2 of as we refer to it as Snowmageddon here in northern Manitoba. We have had record snowfall, the likes we've never seen before at this time of year, and the kind of snow that we've seen. And the overall message has been communities just do not have the capacity to deal with what climate change is bringing, whether it's in terms of historic wildfires, historic flooding, and obviously the kind of precipitation. First Nations are clear on the kinds of infrastructure investments that they need to be able to prepare in the face of climate change, to be able to mitigate the devastating impacts. And frankly, the only party that doesn't seem to get it is the federal government, that continues to ignore calls for to work on the airport in Wasagamak, calls to invest in all-weather road infrastructure, calls to invest in emergency preparedness-related infrastructure. And, people are bracing themselves for what this summer will bring. Bottom line is we need the federal government to step up and work with First Nations now.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député de Nunavut.
And I'd like to thank my colleague for her excellent speech, very informative about showing the realities what Indigenous peoples experience in Canada because of the decades of lack of investments that this liberal government as well as past Conservative governments have done, leading to the continued marginalization of Indigenous peoples. And I wonder if the member could share her thoughts on what will happen because of the budget announcement, what will happen to Indigenous peoples, even if this bill is passed, what will happen with Indigenous peoples once we start actually seeing commitments rather than inaction.
L'honorable député de Churchill-Kiwatinuk-Aski.
Thank you to my colleague for the question and most importantly for the incredible work that she does on behalf of the people from Nunavut and as Indigenous Services Critic and Crown Indigenous Relations Critic for the NDP. I'm so honored to work alongside her and our incredible team. And I would say that this budget is a huge disappointment for Indigenous communities. Indigenous national and regional leaders have been very clear. It misses the mark in so many ways. And I will say I'm proud of the work that we in the NDP did to fight back against a number of the cuts that were proposed. But let's not kid ourselves. The less than 1% funding on housing and infrastructure is a serious failure on the part of the Liberal government. And it continues a legacy of Liberal underfunding that we saw under Paul Martin, and we've seen time and time again from the Liberals and, of course, the Conservatives. The third world living conditions in Indigenous communities did not just happen. They are the result of chronic underfunding, and they are the result of choices that Liberal and Conservative governments have made to prioritize their rich and powerful friends rather than investing and working with Indigenous communities to make the difference that they deserve, and also that I would say Canada is obligated to making as well.
Questions et commentaires. Donc, je reconnais l'honorable député de Nanaimo, Lady Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for her very important speech. I'm wondering if the member could share a little bit more about why she feels that the Liberals, despite being in government for 7 years, have made repeated promises to Indigenous people and broken so many of them. I'm wondering if the member can share why she feels that it's taken us so long to get to where we are now, where those gaps are that she was talking about, and perhaps provide us with her thoughts on the implications and impacts on Indigenous people across the country. Thank you.
L'honorable député de Churchill-Kiwatinook-Aski a 1 minute 10 pour répondre.
1 minute, 10 seconds.
Thank you very much, my colleague, and proud to work with her as she is a great defender on behalf of Indigenous communities in her constituency in British Columbia. I will say that, what we're seeing from the Liberals is something we've seen from colonial-minded governments of the past, Liberal and Conservative, where certainly on the Liberal end, they've talked a good talk on reconciliation, on their most important relationship being that with Indigenous peoples. But if you look at the action and certainly the lack of action on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the lack of investment in the housing and infrastructure gap, the sunsetting of programs to support residential school survivors. This is the Liberal way, and Indigenous peoples deserve far better.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate.
La Chambre est-elle prête à se...
The question is as follows. Mr. Ananda Sangari, seconded by Ms. Hutchins, moves that the amendments made by the Senate to Bill C-29, an act to provide for the establishment of a National Council for Reconciliation, be now read a second time and concurred in. If a member participating in person wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair.
Présidence. Je reconnais l'honorable député.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We would request a recorded vote.
Très bien. Conformément à l'article 45 du règlement, le...
Very well. Pursuant to Standing Order 45, the division stands deferred until Monday, April 29th, 2024, at the expiry of the time provided for oral questions.
Je reconnais l'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
The Honorable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Canvas, you'd find unanimous consent at this time to call it 1:30 so we could begin private members' hour.
Y a-t-il le consentement unanime?
Is there unanimous consent?
Oui. Très bien. Comme il est 13h30.
It being 1:30, the House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business as listed on today's order paper.
Affaires et amendements des députés, reprise du débat en deuxième lecture du projet de loi C3.
Resuming debate at second reading of Bill C-351, an act to amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, maximum security offenders, standing in the name of Mr. Généreux.
Reprise du débat. Je demanderai aux collègues un peu.
Resuming debate, I would request decorum so that we can listen to the speech made by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to be able to rise and add a few thoughts on this on Bill 351. And it's interesting. After all, it's one of those planks that the Conservative Party talk about. Remember, they have those 4 things that they're talking, saying these are the things that we want to do if we were, heaven forbid, to actually form government, Mr. Speaker. One of them is they're going to abolish crime. I'm not too sure exactly how they're going to abolish crime. I think they have some sort of a wand in the background, or through legislation they're just going to make it illegal to commit a crime. Therefore, if you make it illegal to commit a crime, then a crime will go away. I suspect that's what they're thinking, Mr. Speaker. Now, I say that somewhat sarcastically, I would suggest, but I can tell you, when I look at this bill, it reinforces, I believe, some of the need to maybe chastise the Conservative Party and their approach in terms of how it is that they like to say one thing when they're in opposition and actually do something else when they're in government, Mr. Speaker. And this is something in which, I was surprised in terms of going over the summary. And I'd ask my friends across the way to follow along here. And I'm sure you would agree with me that there's quite a bit of hypocrisy that they might be witnessing firsthand, Mr. Speaker. This is the summary of the bill. Bill C-351 seeks to amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act to require that inmates who have designated as a dangerous offender or convicted of more than one count of first-degree murder be classified as a maximum security offender and confined in a, and this is the really important part, Mr. Speaker, be confined in a maximum security by the Correctional Services Canada. Now, there is many thoughts that come to my mind in regards to what it is that's being proposed. I could go on to the technicalities of having and entrusting the people that are in place, that are professionally trained individuals that have done a fairly incredible job in terms of our jails, our correctional facilities, and so forth, and having more faith in them, Mr. Speaker. I could comment on that, but rather I want to point out and expand upon the comments when I said about the hypocrisy issue. Because many members will recall the horrific brutality of the Tory Stafford and the abuse and murder that ultimately had taken place there. In fact, it wasn't that long ago when we were hearing a regurgitation of it by a number of Conservative members of Parliament that were standing up and were raising the issue in fairly graphic detail at times, Mr. Speaker. They were doing that because Terry Lynn McClintock was actually transferred into a healing lodge. And the Conservative Party was absolutely outraged because that had taken place, Mr. Speaker. So a number of them took it upon themselves to stand up and, as I say, graphically explain in terms of what had taken place to the victim, and somewhat referencing the family. And one cannot help, even to this day, I would extend my most sincerest condolences and in recognizing the horrific actions that had taken place, Mr. Speaker. The family and the community is still living with that tragedy, Mr. Speaker. Having said that, we were being soundly criticized. Ralph Goodale, I believe, was the one that was the Minister of Public Services at the time, where he was being criticized, or Public Safety at the time, because of this transfer. And I remember it quite well because it was actually being debated, and I know that, Mr. Speaker, that I actually had commented on the issue. And as the debate went on, one of the things that we found out, that it was actually under Stephen Harper and his government that saw Terry Lynn McClintock actually transferred out of a high security prison into the medium security prison, which enabled her to ultimately be transferred into the Healing Lodge. So you do a little bit more research into it, Mr. Speaker, and what you'll find is that that's not the first person, while the Conservative government, or when the Conservative Party was actually in power, where we saw a mass murderer actually being transferred out of high security into medium security. Now we have a private member's bill that is saying we are against what it is that Stephen Harper did in his government. What Stephen Harper and his government did is allowed the professionals the individuals that are charged with the responsibility of issues such as jail conditions and the type of incarceration and so forth, Mr. Speaker. Stephen Harper did what it is that is expected of the Prime Minister. Where were the Conservative voices back then? The leader of the Conservative Party today, Mr. Speaker, was actually in the cabinet of Stephen Harper. So I'm sure you can appreciate why it is that I am a little skeptical of how the Conservative Party today is now taking a position where they say they want high security and it's absolutely mandatory, Mr. Speaker. You know, I think that at the end of the day, it is all about the votes for the Conservative Party. It's not about the issues, and they have demonstrated that. You know, it's interesting when you take a look at the amount of time, for example, they started recently talking about auto thefts. And now they're being critical of the government. And we've taken tangible actions on that, Mr. Speaker. You know, when I was in the provincial legislature in Manitoba, there's the year, I think it was 2007, 2008. Now, I might be off by a year or two, but you know who the Prime Minister was? Stephen Harper. You know who was with Stephen Harper? The leader of the Conservative Party today. And you know, in the auto theft, there was no province in the country that had more auto theft than the province of Manitoba. And it was by a long shot, not even on a per capita basis. On a per capita basis, it would have been astronomical difference. We had a serious issue with auto theft. Now, what had taken place, what got Manitoba back on the right track, was when we had law enforcement, the federal government, and the province coming together and coming up with a solution that would deal with auto theft in the province of Manitoba. And I can tell you, it was very effective once it really got going, Madam Speaker. So from literally, and you know, don't quote me on the numbers, but I can tell you, Madam Speaker, you're talking about thousands and thousands of vehicles. If you take a look at Manitoba, we had far more vehicles being stolen in the province of Manitoba with a population base of under 1.2 million back then to what Ontario had, where there was 14 million plus people. Yet we still had more vehicles being stolen. It took the governments coming together, Madam Speaker. And that's what made the difference. And that's what we're seeing for whether it's Ontario or Quebec in trying to deal with this very serious issue. And therein it lies the difference between the Conservatives and the Liberals in terms of contrast. As a government, we're prepared to work with other jurisdictions in order to have the backs and support Canadians in whatever way we can. Contrast that to the Conservatives, who are more interested in the bumper stickers than they are in terms of resolving the problems. And that's kind of the way in which I see Bill 351, Madam Speaker, which is an actual flip-flop from the position that they held when they were actually in government and Stephen Harper was the Prime Minister. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate. The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. Madam Speaker, I rise today to speak to Bill C-351, which is sponsored by the Conservative member for Montmagny-Lillet-Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. I followed the saga surrounding the transfer of Paul Bernardo from a maximum penitentiary to La Macasa Institution. I followed the file because La Macasa Institution is in my riding of Laurentides-Labelle. On March 27th, I spent the day at the institution on the invitation of the Correctional Officers Union. Madam Speaker, what I was told about that day wasn't the fact that about the previous visit that they had from the MP in question, we know very well. We're not concerned about security within the institution. What repulses us is what happens within the institution. And honestly, it's not the fact that the prisoner changed. I'm sorry, I'm looking for my words here. It's Friday. The crimes are repulsive, and that's not what the officers talked to me about. And I list a few things. They spoke to me about issues like drug deliveries via drones. They talked to me about defective, obsolete equipment, which is worrying. They talked to me about staff retention issues. They talked to me about ghost weapons. They talked to me about physical assaults of employees. And I could continue. I spent the day there, Madam Speaker. But instead of focusing on the real issues in federal penitentiaries, the objective is to act for employee safety, who every day work to protect public safety. But the Conservative Party has tabled a sensationalist and populist bill. That's not taking care of people, Madam Speaker. And when one aspires to be in government, that should be the absolute priority, shouldn't it? Taking care of people. Instead of this, the Conservatives want to make people scared by inventing problems where there are none. The member for Kamloops Thompson Caribou did a photo op at La Macasa at the beginning of February. Unfortunately for him, there were some misinformation quoted. When I went, it wasn't to promote myself. I was there to hear from correctional officers and all employees who work to protect public safety in their day-to-day, to understand their reality, to understand what's going on within the walls, to understand this universe that is completely foreign to me, but it is important to learn about it, to be able to not make hasty conclusions, and to have a full view of this crucial component in democratic society. The Bloc Québécois has always been an advocate for victims. My colleague from Rivière-du-Nord already spoke about this bill, and I'll quote a few things that he said. He said, and I quote, "I can ensure that it's the case of the Bloc Québécois that we take the side of victims. It's always been the case, and it will always be the case that we defend victims. But we also protect society. We must never lose sight of the fact that our legal system does not seek solely to punish a criminal or avenge a victim. Its main objective is to ensure a safer society." End of quote. I say often, when it comes to democracy, and I am very partisan, and I admit it, in an evolved democratic society where the rule of law is a fundamental value, we cannot accept, even just a little bit, any kind of interference of politics in the legal system. That is a very basic fact. Montesquieu said in his work De l'Esprit des Lois, he talks about the separation of powers. And in order to avoid having a despot in power, it is absolutely essential to separate the legislative power from the executive power from the judicial power. But this bill would tear down those walls. The Government of Canada, regardless of its color, red, blue, or orange, it cannot seek out arbitrary powers in judicial decisions. Politics has no place. the independence of the Correctional Service of Canada and the Parole Board to make decisions about incarcerated individuals including their level of security. That is part of the quasi-judicial nature of the role that given to them by the legislation. And because these two organizations are tied to the government body, they have administrative tribunals that must render their decisions independently. The Conservatives are proposing withdrawing this independence on decision-making bodies who use objective and impartial criteria to make their decisions. That concerns me, Madam Speaker. Governments need to respect the independence of state organizations, and we saw that with the Harper government. It was often flouted, and once again we see it from the Conservative Party, who's doing it again, and that doesn't bode well for the future. On one hand, we have a Liberal Party who interferes in provincial jurisdictions, and on the other hand, there's a Conservative Party that wants to interfere in the independence of government organizations. For me, that's just too much. We're in a tough position. Madam Speaker, the bill by the Conservative member from Montmagny-Lille-Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup, completely sets aside the principle that these prisoners should be dealt with with a view to rehabilitation. In our society, we do not want penitentiaries to become criminal factories. We want them to be places of penitence, of course, but also opportunities for rehabilitation. In our society, we want the separation of powers to be respected. In our society, we want human rights to be respected. In our society, we need to have second chances for those who have shown a will to reintegrate into society and to turn their lives around. And in our society, we want governments that respect the jurisdictions of everyone. That's my last word. That's the society that we will build when Quebec becomes the Republic of Quebec.
Debate, the honourable member for Hamilton Centre.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And certainly ending the week off debating this bill provides a certain level of weight, I think, to anybody who's recounting the atrocities and the sensationalism that has been kind of re-entered into the public discourse. And certainly, as my Bloc colleague had suggested, I think any discussion in this House needs to be victim-centered. It needs to be survivor-centered. And when we propose legislation, I think it's important that we have a duty and responsibility to think about all the ways in which our rhetoric and in which our communications might be received in the general public and might actually have some harm. And so before I even begin my remarks, I just want to reflect on, given the nature of this particular reactionary piece of legislation, just the impacts that Bernardo would have had in my community, in my area. Being the member of Hamilton Centre, you'll recall that 2 of his victims were right in our region. It would have been the early 90s, Madam Speaker, when, as a young adult of 12 or 13 years, I can recall being in a recreation center as it happened to be, I can remember it crystal clear, at a karate tournament, when the news broke of the atrocities that happened in the community. And I think about this because and I'm sure everybody in this House did this, when they reflect upon the monstrosities that were committed and they went back through that, they would know that, of course, Leslie, Aaron Mahaffey and Kristen French, and indeed even Tammy Homoka, 3 victims of these 2 brutal and vicious criminals. But sometimes what is lost is that there is also survivors, that there are people who are watching this debate right now who would have had a direct connection, a very violent and traumatic connection to the atrocities committed by Paul Bernardo. And I want them to know that if they're watching, that as do Democrats, and indeed many folks in here across all party lines, I just want to reflect on the fact that they're still living through the horrors that have been expressed in this House, and we want to make sure that any approach that we have needs to be victim-centered, Madam Speaker. I don't believe that this particular piece of legislation is necessarily victim-centered. I don't believe that it offers victims any of the four foundational principles of victim-centered approaches to things like sexual assault, gender-based violence, the idea of safety and respect. I think that it has been sensationalized and it has been used as, again, one of the most atrocious and evil and despicable things that a human being could do to another person. It has been used to be generalized that all people caught within these frameworks would be comparable to this. I want to suggest that that is not the case. And I want to honor the survivors who might be tuning in to know that I think if there's any good that comes of this debate, it's that we should be shifting our justice strategies, not just to crime and punishment, but again, to victim and survivor-centered approaches. Let's be clear about what this is. This bill amends the Corrections and Conditional Release Act to require that inmates who have been found to be dangerous offenders or convicted of more than one first-degree murder be assigned a security classification of maximum and confined in a maximum security penitentiary or area in a penitentiary for the duration of their sentence. Indeed, a reflection of I think all social science would agree, a failed kind of tough-on-crime approach. The reason being is because within the due bounds of our law, Madam Speaker, there are scenarios, setting aside what the atrocities of Paul Bernardo were, there are scenarios that people based on this will end up eventually leaving prison. So the question becomes, what is it that we are unleashing into our community once they've been incarcerated for decades of their life? How are we reflecting upon the impacts of any prospect of rehabilitation lost by this failed social approach, this failed conservative approach to tough on crime, when we put people deeply violent people sometimes, deeply problematic people who are traumatized, we put them into these settings that continue to dehumanize them, and then what? And then we eventually will have to work through what will happen when they return to our communities. It's not like there's not better examples around the world. You only have to look to what some of the Scandinavian countries have done when it comes to rehabilitation. Norway's rate of recidivism decreased from a high of 70% in 1992 to the lowest in the world at 20% after they started community-based correctional facilities and focused on rehabilitation. Now, when I say these words, it's important for the public and indeed the members of this House not to conflate the evils and monstrosities of the worst and most violent among us, but understand that laws ought not be a knee-jerk response to individual failings or individual cases, but actually need to be a collective response to our society's social pressures. The U.S., with its tough on crime, which the Canadian Republican Party has seemed to adopt it, that their rate of return is 76.6%. I mean, even the fiscal conservatives amongst them, the ones that are truly fiscal conservative, would recognize the cost of incarceration is enormous. There needs to be discretion. There needs to be the ability for those that are honestly taking steps for rehabilitation to be rehabilitated, to go from an institutionalization of a maximum security prison to conditions that would better match the realities of the outside world, so that when they're released, the likelihood of them reoffending drops. It's not my opinion. These are the facts, Madam Speaker. But unfortunately, punishment is the only tool that the Conservatives have in their toolbox when dealing with these issues. Rehabilitation isn't even in their vocabulary, Madam Speaker. Their position in this regard is one that is sensationalist, does prey upon the most basic and base fears of society based on the most evil that walk among us. There are exceptional cases of violence in this country. I am not naive to that. There are people who have done unspeakable things, but our system currently deals with that. Were there administrative errors? Could there be administrative errors from time to time? Absolutely, that could be the case. But concerning the transfer of Paul Bernardo, Dr. Ivan Zinger, the correctional investigator of Canada, in his written submission to SECU committee on November 27 said, in this case, it is especially important to make clear that Canada's correctional system is based on the principles the rule of law follows sentenced persons in prison. The rule of law, Madam Speaker. Imprisonment does not mean total deprivation and absolute forfeiture of your rights. The investigator went on to say that my office cannot and does not select or decline cases on the basis of one's criminal conduct or notoriety. My office serves all federally sentenced persons regardless of their sentence. That is the underlying principle of the rule of law, Madam Speaker. So I would encourage members in this House, including the so-called tough-on-crime Conservatives, to reflect on ways, perhaps within the remaining months of this session, the remaining time that we are in this legislature, this Parliament. I would encourage them to shift their thinking and to start to actually think about the victims and survivors of crime as the primary priority for our legislative responses. I would like them to think about the material conditions for people currently within our federal prison systems. I would like them to think about the investments that could be made to support people in mental health, to support people in social crisis, Madam Speaker. And with that, I thank you for this time, and I'll take my last 5 seconds again to reflect upon not just the victims that were murdered by Paul Bernardo, but all the survivors who may in fact be watching into this. Know that as New Democrats, our heart goes out to you and your families and the communities impacted by this. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the honourable member Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's been almost a year since one of the most notorious serial killers in Canada was moved from maximum security prison to a medium security facility under provisions of the NDP Liberal so-called justice legislation C-83. This serial killer is infamous for his long string of rapes in Scarborough, the rape, torture, and murder of his sister-in-law, and his rape, torture, and murder of 2 very young innocent girls from St. Catharines. We all know that his partner in crime, his wife, Carla Homolka, skated with a 10-year sentence, despite actively participating in the crimes, as per the videotape the police had in their possession. This rapist, this serial killer, this monster is Paul Bernardo. And here let me acknowledge the pain and suffering and the repeated victimization of the families of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. I cannot imagine the pain that you live with every day. God bless you. Madam Speaker, after Bernardo, that monster, was found guilty of his crimes, the judge correctly sentenced him to life imprisonment as a dangerous offender, meaning he should have stayed locked up in maximum security until he died of old age. But no, to our current government, this woke bunch of MPs that are running our justice system, they decided that Paul Bernardo is the real victim, a nice, fine, misunderstood fellow who deserves medium security. So guess what? They passed a law, Bill C-83, which explicitly tells police, judges, and Corrections Canada to impose the least restrictive measures on a person as possible. In practice, this means that this monster, Paul Bernardo, now lives in a dormitory, has a tennis court, an ice rink for recreation, access to sharp instruments when he gets that urge to murder again, not even close to maximum security. That makes no sense. On June 23rd last year, I asked the Justice Minister in this very House why Paul Bernardo gets such special treatment. You know what his answer was? Well, of course, he didn't answer at all. Instead, one of the Prime Minister's attack dogs got up and said that just because Paul Bernardo is a bad man, it doesn't mean they did anything wrong with their legislation. Yes, you heard me right. The Liberals refusing to take responsibility for their own actions. But don't worry, since the current NDP Liberal government refuses to take responsibility for their own actions, it will be the Conservatives who once again step up to the plate and fix the situation. And what is that fix? Well, this bill, C-351, is a bill introduced par mon grand collègue conservateur du Québec. This legislation fixes the mess by the Liberals in the Corrections and Conditional Release Act. It amends Section 28 of the Act, which currently says, if a person is to be confined in a penitentiary, that service shall take all reasonable steps to ensure that the penitentiary is one that provides them with the least restrictive environment. That's what the Liberals changed it to say. Make it as easy on the convicted criminal as possible. This is why Bernardo is getting all the special treatment. My colleague's bill proposed to change that to say, ensure that the penitentiary is one that provides them with an environment that contains only the necessary restrictions. In other words, only make it easier on a convicted criminal if it's absolutely necessary. This legislation is making a significant fix, changing the words least restrictive environment to environment that contains only the necessary restrictions. While a simple language change, this is a massive policy change. When it comes to crime and what to do with criminals that victimize Canadians, Conservatives, such as myself, my colleague, and our leader, have very different approaches than the NDP Liberal government. Conservatives believe that victims of crimes, those who are innocent, those who are terrorized in their own homes, those who have their cars stolen, those who are mugged in our streets, those who are raped, and those whose family members are murdered, those victims should come first. NDP Liberals have a very different approach than Conservatives to crime. I believe in common sense. If a crime is committed, the criminal needs to answer. The woke NDP Liberal approach is that the criminal is the single most important person in the justice system. They believe, and they have written into law, that the police, prosecutors, judges, jurors, and jailers must take into account diversity, equity, inclusion, critical race theory when dealing with criminals. They have put into place checklists. Does this criminal have any sort of skin color, racial background, sexual identity, or anything in their background which warrants that criminal to walk away scot-free? If so, let them go. That is the NDP Liberal approach to criminal justice. This woke crowd doesn't care if a criminal has raped a woman, kidnapped a child, or murdered an Indigenous man, because in their mind, that so-called underprivileged criminal is more important than any victim can be. In their topsy-turvy worldview, they actually see those committing the crimes as the people that need to be cared for, while the actual victims continue to suffer over and over again. Senator Kim Pate, appointed by the current Liberal Prime Minister, summed up the Liberal hug-a-thug position quite nicely last year when she addressed the Fredericton City Council. I quote, Canada's criminal legal system is unjust, discriminatory, and biased against Indigenous people and people of colour. Madam Speaker, I agree. It has been unjust against Indigenous victims of crime like those on the James Smith Cree Nation. The coroner's inquest, which was held in my home riding of Saskatoon West, by the way, was clear on this point. The man who murdered all those Indigenous people on the reserve should have never been released in the first place. But yet folks like Senator Pate don't particularly care about those victims, do they? Instead, they're making excuses for the inexcusable. Senator Pate is one of the many examples of what is absolutely wrong with NDP Liberal justice. Once a crime is committed, the criminal must be punished, period. And let me repeat that for the slow ones over there. Once a crime is committed, the criminal must be punished, period. That's why, Madam Speaker, a common-sense Conservative government will bring in tough-on-crime legislation. We will lock up the criminals, we will stop the crime. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and critical race theory approaches that lead to hug-a-thug and repeat offenders will be swept away. Common-sense Conservatives will bring back mandatory minimums. We will crack down on those who sexually exploit our children, those who peddle sexually explicit images of children on the internet. Indeed, my Conservative colleague from North Okanagan-Shuswap brought in his private member's bill C-291 to do this very thing. We will take the issue of women being trafficked into sexual slavery seriously and not laugh it off as sex workers and body positivity as men pay their pimps in order to abuse and demean women. My colleague, the Conservative MP from Peace River Westlock, has introduced legislation in this House to accomplish this. Bill C-308 is an act respecting national strategy to combat human trafficking. And we will ensure that men who commit violence against pregnant women face stiffer sentences. The NDP and Liberals voted to kill this legislation on the justification that beating a pregnant woman's census is just another form of abortion, almost as if it's a good thing. I would argue that the last thing a civilized country like Canada should do is beat pregnant women and not punish criminals properly for it. I proudly supported the legislation brought forward by my Conservative colleague from Yorkton Melville, which would have allowed the judge to consider pregnancy as an aggravating factor when sentencing someone who has beaten a pregnant woman. Another example? Why not? Let's contrast, let's juxtapose, let's expose the NDP Liberals' soft on crime approach. My Conservative colleague, the MP for Selkirk Interlake Eastman, has introduced Bill C-296, Respecting Families of Murdered and Brutalized Persons Act, which makes life imprisonment actually life imprisonment. This means if you commit...
Point of order. The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. The member we've just been raising the issue of false titles. He just used it again. NDP Liberal, Bloc Liberal government. These are false titles. It is a falsehood, and it should not be used in the House of Commons.
Again, these were points of orders that were raised earlier, and as the honourable member knows, there is the Speaker is reviewing the points of orders that were raised, the issues that were raised, and we'll be back to the House in the next few weeks with some recommendations on how to move forward with some of what is being said. At this point, I'm going to allow the honourable member for Montmagny for Saskatoon West to resume his speech. He has 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I know it really annoys the NDP when we talk about this. They need to stop supporting the Liberals if that's what they want. This means that if you commit murder and get a life sentence, you serve a minimum of 25 to 40 years before parole eligibility. Because let's face it, right now the sentences under this current woke system of putting criminals first means letting murderers walk away with very little time served. I'll give you some examples. Many of you recall a few years back when the NDP Liberals made changes to ease up on the sentencing rules. Around that time, Christopher Garnier drugged, raped, and murdered off-duty Halifax police officer Catherine Campbell. He did horrible things to her and spread her body parts around Halifax and, quote, treated her remains as human garbage, according to the judge. As outraged as the judge was, the best he could do was sentence this serial rapist and now murderer to 13.5 years, reduced to only 11 years after time served. Imagine that, 11 years for drugging, raping, murdering, and desecrating the body of a police officer. By the way, the coroner testified that it took Catherine Campbell 6 minutes to die by strangulation after her rape. So that's just 2 years of prison time for every minute he took to kill her, only in Canada, and only in the NDP Liberals' woke version of Canada. Let's talk about Ryland Heavenfire in Calgary. This man only got 4 years for shooting and killing his brother with a gun. The facts are undisputed. I quote, Heavenfire pointed the shotgun he was carrying at his brother and shot him in the face. Yet the judge said this man could be rehabilitated. What about punishing Heavenfire for taking the life of his brother? Doesn't his brother's life count even a little bit here? Or is that victim just, in this story, just another piece of human garbage? The scales of justice are represented by an icon of a lady wearing a blindfold. She does not see race. She does not see skin color. She does not see who you pray to. All she cares about is balancing the scales. What is fair to the victims? That is justice. Is 4 years for raising a shotgun, pulling the trigger, and murdering his brother really justice? Conservatives believe that if someone murders someone, then they should be punished for their crime. For those of us with actual common sense, it is not the victims that should be treated like human garbage. Madam Speaker, let me wrap up by saying that I and my Conservative colleagues fully support this legislation in front of us today. We believe in common sense justice. We believe criminals like Paul Bernardo, who were sentenced to maximum security, should not be getting special treatment. They should be in maximum security. We believe in justice for the repeat victims, not coddling repeat criminals. Conservatives believe in protecting families and their homes, not allowing rapists and murderers to roam our streets unpunished. It's time to stop the crime. It's time to bring it home.
Reprise de débat, resuming debate. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Montmagny, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup has 5 minutes for his right of reply. Thank you, Madam Speaker, for giving me the opportunity to give a final reply on this private member's bill, Bill C-351, an act to amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, maximum security offenders. I won't go back over the details and the context surrounding the tabling of this bill, but I would simply say that the trigger was the news last June of the transfer of Paul Bernardo from maximum to medium security. That news shocked Canadians and re-traumatized the families and the victims. Maximum security, the view is that Paul Bernardo deserves to stay in a maximum security facility. I'd like to thank those who supported this bill. Unfortunately, my colleague's motion to reverse Bernardo's transfer was rejected. I'd like to thank all those who spoke during the debate, and I have a few comments to make. The Liberals said that we don't care about women. Nothing could be more false. We've always been concerned about victims, and the vast majority of victims of crime are unfortunately women. I also heard Liberals saying that we were scaremongering with this bill. And they wrongly assert that we want Canadians to believe that cases like Bernardo's are commonplace. That's not the purpose of this bill at all. A criminal as dangerous as Bernardo is very unlikely to be released, but the fact that he was transferred from maximum to medium security is what we want to avoid having happen. And I repeat, the purpose of this bill is quite simply to make sure that this kind of criminal remains in maximum security and not in places where they would have much more generous privileges given the heinous crimes they committed. And what's even more important is to avoid having the families and the victims be re-traumatized by things that no one should ever have to experience. Colleagues talked about rehabilitation. They said we don't understand that. That's wholly false. We do believe in rehabilitation, especially when it comes to young offenders. For some offenses, a second chance is the way to go. But in the case of Bernardo, you must surely agree, Madam Speaker, that rehabilitation is impossible. It's out of the question for such a monster. And there are 1,000 dangerous offenders in Canada. So the same goes for them. But this government is so soft on crime. And given their answer to my colleague from Kamloops, we are given to understand that many of these offenders are in medium or even minimum security facilities. And that shows that this government does not have its priorities straight. This government thinks the right thing to do is to give dangerous criminals the least restrictive environment possible. That's what happened in 2009 when C-83 was passed. The government was just thinking about the fate of the criminals and not the families and the victims. And that's what this government has done after 9 years in power. Here on this side of the House, we're on the side of the victims and not on the side of the criminals. That's why I tabled this bill, and I'm very proud of it. Where the Liberals failed, we will succeed. We will restore common sense to our court and correctional systems. Thank you, Madam Speaker, for giving me the opportunity to speak one last time to this bill. And clearly, we'll be asking for recorded division. I know you're going to ask me again, but I just thought I'd get there before you. The question is the following on. Mr. Généreux, seconded by Ms. Falk. Battleford Lloydminster moves that Bill C-351, an act to amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, Maximum Security Offenders, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security.
In person, l'honorable député de Montmagny.
The honourable member for Montmagny. I'd like to request a recorded division. Pursuant to Standing Order 93, the division stands deferred until Wednesday, May 1st, at the expiry of the time provided for oral questions. It being 1:39, the House stands adjourned until Monday, April 29th, 2024 at 11 a.m. pursuant to Standing Orders 28.2 and 24.1. Have a good weekend and a good week in your ridings.
Anyone new to the channel, please like and subscribe. That is it. They are closed next week, so it'll be a week away before the House of Commons goes live again. I will let you know the time, and have a good week.